Menjejak kaki menapak bumi, melangkah pasti untuk cakrawala ilmu. Jaga tradisi, bernas inovasi, lambungkan prestasi. Menyatu dalam visi, menjadi perguruan tinggi unggul, rujukan ilmu pengetahuan dan teknologi, serta bidang kependidikan. Didaulat sebagai kota pendidikan, Kota Malang menjadi rumah bagi cita anak bangsa. Ragam asa keilmuan berpadu harmonis dalam semangat pembaruan. Salah satu garda terdepan dalam pengembangan potensi insani, termasuk pendidikan. Universitas Negeri Malang adalah perguruan tinggi yang mengembangkan sayap keilmuan dalam bidang pendidikan, pengajaran, dan pembelajaran. Kampus yang lebih dikenal dengan nama UM ini senantiasa berada dalam jajaran perguruan tinggi terbaik di Indonesia. Kualitas UM sebagai institusi pendidikan yang unggul senantiasa menyediakan gerbong generasi pencetak kemajuan bangsa. Berdiri sejak 18 Oktober 1954, UM lahir dengan nama Perguruan Tinggi Pendidikan Guru atau PTPG. Kemudian PTPG mengalami perubahan nama pada tahun 1957 menjadi Fakultas Keguruan Ilmu Pendidikan atau FKIP, menjejak kaki dan menjadi Institut Keguruan dan Ilmu Pendidikan atau ICHSE pada tahun 1963. Bernas inovasi menjelang genap 5 dekade atau pada tahun 1999. Transformasi dilakukan kembali dengan menjadi Universitas Negeri Malang yang dikenal hingga saat ini sebagai kota pendidikan. 65 tahun berkiprah, UM telah mengokohkan diri menjadi salah satu bagian dari 12 lembaga perguruan tinggi kependidikan atau LPTIK dan termasuk dalam 20 kampus terbaik di Indonesia. Universitas Negeri Malang terletak tak jauh dari pintu masuk Kota Malang bagian timur, sedangkan kampus 3 dan pembelajaran. Makam Bung Karno, Kota Blitar. Melalui visi dan misi yang telah ditetapkan, UM mengabdikan diri sebagai The Learning University sejak tahun 2009. UM senantiasa menghasilkan lulusan yang memiliki kompetensi akademik, profesi yang bertakwa, berakhlak mulia, cerdas, mandiri, memiliki komitmen kebangsaan, dan mampu berkembang secara profesional. Melalui jenjang diploma hingga doktoral, UM berkomitmen menciptakan insan yang berdedikasi pada dunia pendidikan. Lebih dari 34.000 mahasiswa UM tersebar dalam berbagai program pendidikan berkualitas dan bereputasi tinggi. Selain mahasiswa reguler, UM juga menerima mahasiswa luar negeri sebagai langkah melebarkan kiprah dalam dunia pendidikan internasional. UM selalu berupaya menghasilkan karya akademik dalam bidang ilmu pengetahuan dan teknologi, serta kependidikan yang bermutu dan unggul. UM memiliki 120 program studi dengan lebih dari 3.000 mata kuliah. Sebanyak 57 program studi telah terakreditasi A, dan 46 program studi telah terakreditasi B. Program studi tersebut dibawahi dalam 8 fakultas yang antara lain: Fakultas Ilmu Pendidikan, Fakultas Sastra, Fakultas Matematika dan Ilmu Pengetahuan Alam, Fakultas Ekonomi, Fakultas Teknik, Fakultas Ilmu Keolahragaan, Fakultas Ilmu Sosial, dan Fakultas Pendidikan Psikologi. Sejak tahun 2018, UM menerapkan kurikulum transdisipliner dan kurikulum berbasis kehidupan, life-based learning. UM juga mewadahi pengembangan diri dan prestasi sesuai bakat dan minat mahasiswa melalui 34 UKM yang terbagi menjadi kelompok penalaran, kesenian, olahraga, kesejahteraan, kerohanian, dan minat khusus. Dalam rangka menghasilkan kinerja institusi yang otonom, akuntabel, dan transparan untuk menjamin peningkatan kualitas berkelanjutan, UM senantiasa mengupayakan sarana penunjang akademik yang terbaik. Beberapa di antaranya ialah perpustakaan, masjid, fasilitas olahraga, dan gedung pertemuan yang representatif untuk kegiatan akademik maupun non-akademik. UM juga mempunyai pusat pengkajian Pancasila, poliklinik, biro konseling corner, sebagai bentuk pengamalan terhadap Tridharma perguruan tinggi. Pada tahun 2019, peningkatan jumlah publikasi dosen dan mahasiswa mencapai 500 jurnal ilmiah yang telah terakreditasi nasional hingga internasional. Keterlibatan UM pada pengabdian kepada masyarakat juga terus ditekankan untuk menyelesaikan beberapa persoalan yang ada. UM juga menyelenggarakan kursus berbagai bidang keterampilan yang diwadahi dalam program pendidikan keterampilan otomotif, bisnis, teknologi informasi, dan industri. UM terus melakukan kerjasama dengan berbagai pihak, baik kerjasama nasional maupun kerjasama internasional, dengan total 200 stakeholder terkait. Di antara wujud nyata kerjasama yang telah dilakukan, yaitu proyek 4-in-1 antara UM dengan ISDB, Islamic Development Bank. Prestasi demi prestasi yang membanggakan telah UM torehkan, mulai dari skala regional, nasional, hingga internasional. UM merupakan kampus yang ramah dengan generasi milenial. UM senantiasa terus berkembang dan bekerja sama membangun bangsa. Ke depan, UM berkomitmen untuk menjadi pusat unggulan dalam bidang inovasi belajar. Universitas Negeri Malang senantiasa berkarya dan terus berkarya untuk bangsa. Bersama UM, kami belajar meneliti dan mengabdi untuk bumi pertiwi, memberikan kontribusi, gagasan, dan karya nyata. Universitas Negeri Malang, The Learning University.
Sejarah menuntunmu untuk bijak mengambil langkah. Dimulai dari sini, tekad besar akan tercipta dari mereka yang siap menggali dan berbagi ilmu untuk generasi penerus bangsa. Di tempat ini, jurusan sejarah Universitas Negeri Malang.
Jurusan Sejarah Fakultas Ilmu Sosial Universitas Negeri Malang memiliki sejarah yang cukup panjang. Mulai didirikan tanggal 18 Oktober 1954 dengan nama PTPG, Perguruan Tinggi Pendidikan Guru. PTPG menjadi bagian dari Universitas Airlangga. Pada tanggal 1 Mei 1963, FKIP Universitas Airlangga berubah menjadi IKIP Malang. Dengan demikian, kita sebagai prodi pendidikan sejarah sudah cukup memiliki pengalaman panjang. Pendidikan sejarah, ilmu sejarah mendapatkan nilai akreditasi A, dan prodi S2 Pendidikan Sejarah memiliki akreditasi B. Jurusan sejarah memiliki beberapa keunggulan, antara lain memiliki dosen yang kompeten di bidangnya dan sudah bersertifikasi. Jurusan sejarah juga memiliki sarana dan prasarana yang lengkap yang dapat menunjang pembelajaran mahasiswa, sehingga mahasiswa dengan nyaman dan aman dapat belajar. Jurusan sejarah juga memiliki jurnal yang terakreditasi Sinta 3 dan Sinta 4 Jurusan Sejarah bekerja sama dengan ICHSE dari Belanda. Dari dalam negeri, beberapa instansi telah menjalin kerjasama dengan pihak jurusan sejarah. Antara lain, Balai Arkeologi Kalimantan Selatan, BPCB Wilayah Jawa Timur, MGMP Jawa Timur, Dinas Kebudayaan dan Pariwisata Jawa Timur, Dinas Pendidikan baik di Jawa Timur maupun di kabupaten-kabupaten, dan berbagai universitas di tanah air.
Nama saya Rakai Hino.
Saya Aukira Nalia.
Saya
Pipit Anggraini.
Zain Hasan.
Saya lulusan dari Pendidikan Sejarah.
S1 Ilmu Sejarah.
Saya senang bisa berkuliah di jurusan Sejarah Universitas Negeri Malang.
Salah satu hal yang perlu saya syukuri di hidup saya,
Karena lingkungan pembelajarannya yang menyenangkan, proses pembelajarannya yang kreatif, inovatif, dan komunikatif.
Banyak mata kuliah yang berbobot dan
Memberikan pengalaman dan materi yang luar biasa sebagai persiapan untuk mengajar di sekolah.
saat ini sangat bermanfaat bagi karir saya.
karena di sini saya menemukan lingkungan belajar yang mendukung saya untuk tetap produktif, inovatif, dan juga berprestasi.
Saya bekerja
Di SMA Negeri 1 Malang,
Jurnalis di Jatim Times Network.
Dinas Kebudayaan dan Pendidikan Kota Malang sebagai tim ahli cagar budaya Kota Malang.
Menjadi mahasiswa jurusan Sejarah Universitas Negeri Malang memberikan saya peluang lebih untuk belajar berbagai hal dari para ekspertis.
Swastisa Bahagia.
Tlaha ring tlaha.
Historia
Vitai,
Magistrat.
Langkah besar dimulai saat ini. Mereka akan berhenti ketika langkahmu tidak dimulai. Wujudkan cita-cita mereka dengan semangat dan tekad besar dari pendahulu bangsa. Berpijak dan melangkahlah dari sejarah. Ciptakan lompatan besar untuk negeri. Menengok dari sejarah, tapi tidak untuk kembali.
Menjejak kaki menapak bumi, melangkah pasti untuk cakrawala ilmu. Jaga tradisi, bernas inovasi, lambungkan prestasi. Menyatu dalam visi, menjadi perguruan tinggi unggul, rujukan ilmu pengetahuan dan teknologi, serta bidang kependidikan. Didaulat sebagai kota pendidikan, Kota Malang menjadi rumah bagi cita anak bangsa. Ragam asa keilmuan berpadu harmonis dalam semangat pembaruan. Salah satu garda terdepan dalam pengembangan potensi insani, termasuk pendidikan. Universitas Negeri Malang adalah perguruan tinggi yang mengembangkan sayap keilmuan dalam bidang pendidikan, pengajaran, dan pembelajaran. Kampus yang lebih dikenal dengan nama UM ini senantiasa berada dalam jajaran perguruan tinggi terbaik di Indonesia. Kualitas UM sebagai institusi pendidikan yang unggul senantiasa menyediakan gerbong generasi pencetak kemajuan bangsa. Berdiri sejak 18 Oktober 1954, UM lahir dengan nama Perguruan Tinggi Pendidikan Guru atau PTPG. Kemudian PTPG mengalami perubahan nama pada tahun 1957 menjadi Fakultas Keguruan Ilmu Pendidikan atau FKIP. Dan menjadi Institut Keguruan dan Ilmu Pendidikan atau IKIP pada tahun 1963. Menjelang genap 5 dekade atau pada tahun 1999, transformasi dilakukan kembali dengan menjadi Universitas Negeri Malang yang dikenal hingga saat ini. 65 tahun berkiprah, UM telah mengokohkan diri menjadi salah satu bagian dari 12 lembaga perguruan tinggi kependidikan atau LPTIK dan termasuk dalam 20 kampus terbaik di Indonesia. Kampus 2 UM terletak tak jauh dari pintu masuk Kota Malang bagian timur, sedangkan Kampus 3 terletak tepat di gerbang masuk kawasan Heritage Makam Bung Karno, Kota Blitar. Melalui visi dan misi yang telah ditetapkan, UM mengabdikan diri sebagai The Learning University sejak tahun 2009. UM senantiasa menghasilkan lulusan yang memiliki kompetensi akademik, profesi yang bertakwa, berakhlak mulia, cerdas, mandiri, memiliki komitmen kebangsaan, dan mampu berkembang secara profesional. Melalui jenjang diploma hingga doktoral, UM berkomitmen menciptakan insan yang berdedikasi pada dunia pendidikan. Lebih dari 34.000 mahasiswa UM tersebar dalam berbagai program pendidikan berkualitas dan bereputasi tinggi. Selain mahasiswa reguler, UM juga menerima mahasiswa luar negeri sebagai langkah melebarkan kiprah dalam dunia pendidikan internasional. UM selalu berupaya menghasilkan karya akademik dalam bidang ilmu pengetahuan dan teknologi, serta kependidikan yang bermutu dan unggul. UM memiliki 120 program studi dengan lebih dari 3.000 mata kuliah. Sebanyak 57 program studi telah terakreditasi A dan 46 program studi telah terakreditasi B. Program studi tersebut dibawahi dalam 8 fakultas yang antara lain Fakultas Ilmu Pendidikan, Fakultas Sastra, Fakultas Matematika dan Ilmu Pengetahuan Alam, Fakultas Ekonomi, Fakultas Teknik, Fakultas Ilmu Keolahragaan, Fakultas Ilmu Sosial, dan Fakultas Pendidikan Psikologi. Sejak tahun 2018, UM menerapkan kurikulum transdisipliner dan kurikulum berbasis kehidupan, life-based learning. UM juga mewadahi pengembangan diri dan prestasi sesuai bakat dan minat mahasiswa melalui 34 UKM yang terbagi menjadi kelompok penalaran, kesenian, olahraga, kesejahteraan, kerohanian, dan minat khusus. Dalam rangka menghasilkan kinerja institusi yang otonom, akuntabel, dan transparan untuk menjamin peningkatan kualitas berkelanjutan, UM senantiasa mengupayakan sarana penunjang akademik yang terbaik. Beberapa di antaranya ialah perpustakaan, masjid, fasilitas olahraga, dan gedung pertemuan yang representatif untuk kegiatan akademik maupun non-akademik. UM juga mempunyai pusat pengkajian Pancasila, poliklinik, biro konseling corner sebagai bentuk pengamalan terhadap Tridharma perguruan tinggi. Pada tahun 2019, peningkatan jumlah publikasi dosen dan mahasiswa mencapai 500 jurnal ilmiah yang telah terakreditasi nasional hingga internasional. Keterlibatan UM pada pengabdian kepada masyarakat juga terus ditekankan untuk menyelesaikan beberapa persoalan yang ada. UM juga menyelenggarakan kursus berbagai bidang keterampilan yang diwadahi dalam program pendidikan keterampilan otomotif, bisnis, teknologi informasi, dan industri. UM terus melakukan kerjasama dengan berbagai pihak, baik kerjasama nasional maupun kerjasama internasional, dengan total 200 stakeholder terkait. Di antara wujud nyata kerjasama yang telah dilakukan, yaitu proyek 4-in-1 antara UM dengan ISDB, Islamic Development Bank. Prestasi demi prestasi yang membanggakan telah UM torehkan, mulai dari skala regional, nasional, hingga internasional. UM merupakan kampus yang ramah dengan generasi milenial. UM senantiasa terus berkembang dan bekerja sama membangun bangsa. Ke depan, UM berkomitmen untuk menjadi pusat unggulan dalam bidang inovasi belajar. Universitas Negeri Malang senantiasa berkarya dan terus berkarya untuk bangsa. Bersama UM, kami belajar meneliti dan mengabdi untuk bumi pertiwi, memberikan kontribusi, gagasan, dan karya nyata. Universitas Negeri Malang, The Learning University.
Sejarah menuntunmu untuk bijak mengambil langkah. Dimulai dari sini, tekad besar akan tercipta dari mereka yang siap menggali dan berbagi ilmu untuk generasi penerus bangsa. Di tempat ini, jurusan sejarah Universitas Negeri Malang.
Jurusan Sejarah Fakultas Ilmu Sosial Universitas Negeri Malang memiliki sejarah yang cukup panjang. Mulai didirikan tanggal 18 Oktober 1954 dengan nama PTPG, Perguruan Tinggi Pendidikan Guru. PTPG menjadi bagian dari Universitas Airlangga. Pada tanggal 1 Mei 1963, FKIP Universitas Airlangga berubah menjadi IKIP Malang. Dengan demikian, kita sebagai prodi pendidikan sejarah sudah cukup memiliki pengalaman panjang. Pendidikan sejarah, ilmu sejarah mendapatkan nilai akreditasi A, dan prodi S2 Pendidikan Sejarah memiliki akreditasi B. Jurusan sejarah memiliki beberapa keunggulan, antara lain memiliki dosen yang kompeten di bidangnya dan sudah bersertifikasi. Jurusan sejarah juga memiliki sarana dan prasarana yang lengkap yang dapat menunjang pembelajaran mahasiswa, sehingga mahasiswa dengan nyaman dan aman dapat belajar. Jurusan sejarah juga memiliki jurnal yang terakreditasi, Sinta 3 dan Sinta 4. Jurusan sejarah bekerja sama dengan ICHSE dari Belanda. Dari dalam negeri, beberapa instansi telah menjalin kerjasama dengan pihak jurusan sejarah, antara lain Balai Arkeologi Kalimantan Selatan, BPCB Wilayah Jawa Timur, MGMP Jawa Timur, Dinas Kebudayaan dan Pariwisata Jawa Timur, Dinas Pendidikan baik di Jawa Timur maupun di kabupaten-kabupaten, dan berbagai universitas di tanah air.
Nama saya Raka Hino.
Saya Hawi Kiranalia.
Saya
Pipit Anggraini.
Zainul Hasan.
Saya lulusan dari Pendidikan Sejarah
S1 Ilmu Sejarah.
Saya senang bisa berkuliah di jurusan sejarah Universitas Negeri Malang
Salah satu hal yang perlu saya syukuri di hidup saya.
karena lingkungan pembelajarannya yang menyenangkan, proses pembelajarannya yang kreatif, inovatif, dan komunikatif.
banyak mata kuliah yang berbobot dan
Memberikan pengalaman dan materi yang luar biasa sebagai persiapan untuk mengajar di sekolah.
saat ini sangat bermanfaat bagi karir saya.
Karena di sini saya menemukan lingkungan belajar yang mendukung saya untuk tetap produktif, inovatif, dan juga berprestasi.
Saya bekerja
Di SMA Negeri 1 Malang,
Jurnalis di Jatim Times Network.
Dinas Kebudayaan dan Pendidikan Kota Malang sebagai tim ahli cagar budaya Kota Malang.
Menjadi mahasiswa jurusan sejarah Universitas Negeri Malang memberikan saya peluang lebih untuk belajar berbagai hal dari para ekspertis.
Swastisa Bahagia.
Telaha Ring Telaha. Storia.
Vitai.
Magistrat.
Langkah besar dimulai saat ini. Mereka akan berhenti ketika langkahmu tidak dimulai. Wujudkan cita-cita mereka dengan semangat dan tekad besar dari pendahulu bangsa. Berpijak dan melangkahlah dari sejarah. Ciptakan lompatan besar untuk negeri. Menengok dari sejarah, tapi tidak untuk kembali.
Menjejak kaki menapak bumi, melangkah pasti untuk cakrawala ilmu. Jaga tradisi, bernas inovasi, lambungkan prestasi. Menyatu dalam visi, menjadi perguruan tinggi unggul, rujukan ilmu pengetahuan dan teknologi, serta bidang kependidikan. Didaulat sebagai kota pendidikan, Kota Malang menjadi rumah bagi cita anak bangsa. Ragam asa keilmuan berpadu harmonis dalam semangat pembaruan. Salah satu garda terdepan dalam pengembangan potensi insani, termasuk pendidikan. Universitas Negeri Malang adalah perguruan tinggi yang mengembangkan sayap keilmuan dalam bidang pendidikan, pengajaran, dan pembelajaran. Kampus yang lebih dikenal dengan nama UM ini senantiasa berada dalam jajaran perguruan tinggi terbaik di Indonesia. Kualitas UM sebagai institusi pendidikan yang unggul senantiasa menyediakan gerbong generasi pencetak kemajuan bangsa. Berdiri sejak 18 Oktober 1954, UM lahir dengan nama Perguruan Tinggi Pendidikan Guru atau PTPG. Kemudian PTPG mengalami perubahan nama pada tahun 1957 menjadi Fakultas Keguruan Ilmu Pendidikan atau FKIP dan menjadi Institut Keguruan dan Ilmu Pendidikan atau IKIP pada tahun 1963. Menjelang genap 5 dekade atau pada tahun 1999, transformasi dilakukan kembali dengan menjadi Universitas Negeri Malang yang dikenal hingga saat ini. 65 tahun berkiprah, UM telah mengokohkan diri menjadi salah satu bagian dari 12 lembaga perguruan tinggi kependidikan atau LPTIK dan termasuk dalam 20 kampus terbaik di Indonesia. Kampus 2 UM terletak tak jauh dari pintu masuk Kota Malang bagian timur, sedangkan Kampus 3 terletak tepat di gerbang masuk kawasan Heritage Makam Bung Karno, Kota Blitar. Melalui visi dan misi yang telah ditetapkan, UM mengabdikan diri sebagai The Learning University sejak tahun 2009. UM senantiasa menghasilkan lulusan yang memiliki kompetensi akademik, profesi yang bertakwa, berakhlak mulia, cerdas, mandiri, memiliki komitmen kebangsaan, dan mampu berkembang secara profesional. Melalui jenjang diploma hingga doktoral, UM berkomitmen menciptakan insan yang berdedikasi pada dunia pendidikan. Lebih dari 34.000 mahasiswa UM tersebar dalam berbagai program pendidikan berkualitas dan bereputasi tinggi. Selain mahasiswa reguler, UM juga menerima mahasiswa luar negeri sebagai langkah melebarkan kiprah dalam dunia pendidikan internasional. UM selalu berupaya menghasilkan karya akademik dalam bidang ilmu pengetahuan dan teknologi, serta kependidikan yang bermutu dan unggul. UM memiliki 120 program studi dengan lebih dari 3.000 mata kuliah. Sebanyak 57 program studi telah terakreditasi A dan 46 program studi telah terakreditasi B. Program studi tersebut dibawahi dalam 8 fakultas yang antara lain Fakultas Ilmu Pendidikan, Fakultas Sastra, Fakultas Matematika dan Ilmu Pengetahuan Alam, Fakultas Ekonomi, Fakultas Teknik, Fakultas Ilmu Keolahragaan, Fakultas Ilmu Sosial, dan Fakultas Pendidikan Psikologi. Sejak tahun 2018, UM menerapkan kurikulum transdisipliner dan kurikulum berbasis kehidupan, life-based learning. UM juga mewadahi pengembangan diri dan prestasi sesuai bakat dan minat mahasiswa melalui 34 UKM yang terbagi menjadi kelompok penalaran, kesenian, olahraga, kesejahteraan, kerohanian, dan minat khusus. Dalam rangka menghasilkan kinerja institusi yang otonom, akuntabel, dan transparan untuk menjamin peningkatan kualitas berkelanjutan, UM senantiasa mengupayakan sarana penunjang akademik yang terbaik. Beberapa di antaranya ialah perpustakaan, masjid, fasilitas olahraga, dan gedung pertemuan yang representatif untuk kegiatan akademik maupun non-akademik. UM juga mempunyai pusat pengkajian Pancasila, poliklinik, biro konseling corner, sebagai bentuk pengamalan terhadap Tridharma perguruan tinggi. Pada tahun 2019, peningkatan jumlah publikasi dosen dan mahasiswa mencapai 500 jurnal ilmiah yang telah terakreditasi nasional hingga internasional. Keterlibatan UM pada pengabdian kepada masyarakat juga terus ditekankan untuk menyelesaikan beberapa persoalan yang ada. UM juga menyelenggarakan kursus berbagai bidang keterampilan yang diwadahi dalam program pendidikan keterampilan otomotif, bisnis, teknologi informasi, dan industri. UM terus melakukan kerjasama dengan berbagai pihak, baik kerjasama nasional maupun kerjasama internasional, dengan total 200 stakeholder terkait. Di antara wujud nyata kerjasama yang telah dilakukan, yaitu proyek 4-in-1 antara UM dengan ISDB, Islamic Development Bank. Prestasi demi prestasi yang membanggakan telah UM torehkan, mulai dari skala regional, nasional, hingga internasional. UM merupakan kampus yang ramah dengan generasi milenial. UM senantiasa terus berkembang dan bekerja sama membangun bangsa. Ke depan, UM berkomitmen untuk menjadi pusat unggulan dalam bidang inovasi belajar. Universitas Negeri Malang senantiasa berkarya dan terus berkarya untuk bangsa. Bersama UM, kami belajar meneliti dan mengabdi untuk bumi pertiwi, memberikan kontribusi, gagasan, dan karya nyata. Universitas Negeri Malang, The Learning University.
Sejarah menuntut
Honorable guests, ladies and gentlemen, we will begin shortly in a few minutes. Before that, let us take a moment to review some technical details. First, to help us recognize you, please rename your ID with the verification code. Second, to reduce very sound problem, please mute your audio, but do not forget to turn on your video. Third, you may want to drop your question regarding to the topics via Zoom chat or open camera only on Q&A session later. And last but not least, we would like to remind all participants that you have to fill about the registration form on the link so you can get the e-certificate for today's conference. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Shalom, Om Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's such a great honor for me to be your host for today's conference. I'm Hawi Kiranalia, and welcome to International Conference on History, Social Sciences, and Education 2021. With the theme, Embracing New Perspective in History, Social Sciences, and Education, held by the History Department, Universitas Negeri Malang. First of all, I would like to thank God that has given us blessing to attend this conference. I really appreciate you all to join us today on Saturday, 11th of September 2021, live on YouTube. And I would like to extend a very warm welcome to the Rector of Universitas Negeri Malang, Profesor Dr. Haji Ahmad Rofiuddin, MPD, the keynote speakers, Associate Professor Mark Charles Bailden, Assistant Professor Francis M. Navarro, Profesor Dr. Haryono, MPD, Profesor Gert Os Indi, the Dean of Faculty of Social Science, Universitas Negeri Malang, Profesor Dr. Sumarmi, MPD, the Head of History Department, Universitas Negeri Malang, Dr. Arisapto M. Hum, the Chairperson of International Conference on History, Social Sciences, and Education 2021, Ronald Ridhoi S. Hum, MA, and all presenters and participants of International Conference on History, Social Sciences, and Education 2021. Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, this is the first conference that held by the History Department, Universitas Negeri Malang. This event aimed to discuss the theoretical and practical development of the history, social sciences, and education in Indonesia and other countries. And this year, we try to look for the new perspective about methodology, method, theory, and themes on history, social sciences, and education. And it's almost 2 years we all have been affected by the COVID-19 outbreak. And this has been changed a lot about how we live as a human being. So in this special occasion, we changed the oral presentation to remote presentation through video conference. Before we start the event, let me inform the general agendas for today's event. First, opening. Second, singing Indonesia's national anthem and March of Universitas Negeri Malang. Third, introduction and report from the chairperson of International Conference on History, Social Sciences, and Education 2021. Fourth, opening speech by the Rector of Universitas Negeri Malang. Fifth, pray. Sixth, photo session. Seventh, break. Eighth, first plenary session. Ninth, parallel session. 10th, second plenary session. And 11th, closing. This is the beginning of today's agenda. We will sing our national anthem of Indonesia Raya and March of Universitas Negeri Malang. Thank you very much. Well, ladies and gentlemen, without any further ado, we gladly invite the Chairperson of International Conference on History, Social Sciences and Education 2021 to deliver the report. Please welcome Bapak Ronald Ridhoi, SHUM MA.
Thank you, Ms. Sawiti. Good morning, Excellencies, Rector of Universitas Negeri Malang, Vice Rector, Deans, Vice Deans, Head of Department of History, speakers, participants, and audience. Also, good afternoon and good night to some of you in other countries. It is a great honor and pleasure for me as a chairman of International Conference on History, Social Science, and Education 2021. We know that very difficult to hold an international conference in this pandemic era. However, the progressive technologies can help us to hold the conference by online meeting. Many thanks to all of speakers, Mr. Mark, Mr. Jess, Pak Haryono, and Mr. Kurt, also presenters, and also all of the committee and participants who joined this conference. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to tell you some information about this conference. This is the first conference organized by History Department, Faculty of Social Science, Universitas Negeri Malang. We took the main theme entitled Embracing New Perspective in History, Social Science, and Education, because in Indonesia, the research trend of the sciences were changed progressively. In recent time, we know that the scientific field has blurred boundaries, so this conference aims to discuss that boundaries. Furthermore, we also try to looking for new perspective, method, and methodologies to analyze historical, social, and educational problems in Indonesia. The good news is that more than 300 scholars participated in this event. They sent us very nice paper, but I'm so sorry, we only choose 60 papers to be presented here. We appreciate to you all who send the paper to the committee, and hardly we just inviting some of you who selected. Ladies and gentlemen, we also thanks to speakers, coach, and participants who joined writing coaching clinic a month before, because we got a lot of knowledge and experiences about academic writing, methodology, publication, and also insightful papers. After you attend the coaching clinic, I'm sure that all selected papers has a new notion, new perspective, and themes also. Of course, it represent the different concern and discipline studies according to your expertise. That is very insightful substance, I think. And now we come to the main forum. I hope you can enjoy this conference. Can't wait to see and hear the truly awesome speakers. We are honored to have you in this conference. Thank you all and good morning.
Well, thank you so much, Bapak Ronald Ridhoi, for the report on this wonderful occasion. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we move to the next agenda, that is opening speech. And I would like to invite Professor Dr. Haji Ahmad Rofiuddin MPD to deliver the opening speech and continue with symbolically open this day's conference. Please welcome Professor Dr. Haji Ahmad Rofiuddin MPD.
Thank you. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat pagi, salam sejahtera untuk kita semua, and good morning for everyone. The Excellencies, Dean of Faculty of Social Science, Prof. Sumarmi, the Excellencies, former Dean of Social Science Faculty, Prof. Haryono, distinguished presenter and participant, and all my dearly colleagues. It is true pleasure for me to welcome you to the International Conference on History, Social Science, and Education in this time in Malang. I'm very grateful to you all for taking time off for your busy schedule to attend this important conference. Ladies and gentlemen, International Conference Story on Story and Social Education, Social Science Education, is an international conference that is held regularly every 2 years by the History Department, Faculty of Social Science, Universitas Negeri Malang. This event aims to discuss the theoretical and practical development of the history, social science, and education in Indonesia and other countries, to with academic network through gathering academic from various research institutes and universities. This year, we took embracing new perspective in history, social science, and education as our main topic. We try to look for new perspective about methodology, method, theory, and trends on history and social science and education research. This is because now the academic trend of social science and humanities are experiencing a tremendous progress. It concerns multidisciplinary research, even transdisciplinary, such as history that has various perspectives on methodology and historiography. Now, history is not only about politics, economy, and military, but also environment, social education, culinary, and so on, as well as social science and education with so various of studies. Ladies and gentlemen, bringing the new perspective in history, social science, and education as the main topic, I hope this forum can facilitate the exchange of ideas and knowledge, all of which lead to the development of our history. At last, to all participants, speakers, and other parties who were present in this virtual room, I also hope that this conference can also be the start of academic cooperation and collaboration between us. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. This conference officially open. Thank you very much. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam.
Thank you very much, Bapak Rofi, for the warm opening on this greatest event. Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, we are now officially start the International Conference on History, Social Sciences, and Education 2021. Before we are going to the next agenda, Bapak Najib Jauhari M.Hum will lead our prayer. Bapak Najib Jauhari, time is yours.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Sudah masuk? Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Isma'li an tu'aya ala hasabi i'tiqal Islam wa li ghairil muslimin alaikum tu'aya ala hasabi i'tiqanikum. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Hamda syakirin, hamdan naimin, hamdu yafi ni'amahu wa yakafi mazidah. Ya Rabbana lakal hamdu kama yanbaghi li jalali wajhil karim wa 'azimi sultanik. Allahumma salli wa sallim ala sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallim. Rabbi israh li sadri wa yassir li amri wahlul 'uqdatam min lisani yafqahu qawli. Rabbi zidni ilma warzuqni fahma wa tammim lana bil khairat. Allahumma arinal haqqa haqqan warzuqna ittiba'ah, arinal batila batilan warzuqna ijtinabah. Rabbana atina fid dunya hasanatan wa fil akhirati hasanatan wa qina adzabannar. Subhana rabbika rabbil izzati amma yasifun wa salamun alal mursalin walhamdulillahi rabbil alamin. Wallahul muwaffiq ila aqwamit wa lafu minkum. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you very much, Bapak Najib Jauhari. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we would like to invite all participants to do a photo session. I want to ask all participants that sign on Zoom meeting to turn on the camera. So I think everybody is ready, and I will count on 3, 2, 1. Well, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, before we start the plenary session, I would like to inform to all participants who registered on Zoom meeting to turn on the camera and mute the audio during the plenary session. And now we will begin the first session of keynote speech, and the keynote speaker for the first session is Mr. Belden Mark Charles and Mr. Francis M. Navarro. And now I would like to hand over this forum to the moderator, Ms. Indah Wahyu Puji Utami. And for our moderator today, Ms. Indah, the time is yours.
Thank you, Ms. Hawiki. Good morning, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the very first session of the ICHSE 2021. My name is Indah Utami, and it is such an honor for me to be the moderator of this session, because we have two distinguished keynote speakers that will share their research and experience with us. Now, let me introduce our first speaker. Dr. Mark Belden is an associate professor at Humanities and Social Studies Education and Office of Educational Research, National Institute of Education, or NIE, Nanyang Technological University, Singapore. He has been in a leadership role in research, knowledge mobilization, and partnership, the design, development, and implementation of academic programs, and the management of teams. With his background as international educator for over 30 years in several countries, Prof. Belden has built a strong international networks and collaboration, interdisciplinary work, and service. He also initiated academic program and curriculum development efforts in Singapore. Prof. Mark has a strong publication and conference record in humanities and social sciences. His latest edited book, titled Research on Global Citizenship Education in Asia, Conception, Perception, and Practice, bring together researchers with their new study on global citizenship in Asia. In this session, Prof. Mark Belden will share his research titled Cosmopolitanism in Humanities and Social Sciences in Education and Research. Later on, you can ask your question by raise your hand or type on the chat function in this Zoom meeting. You can either write it in English or Bahasa Indonesia, and I will translate it for you. So without further ado, let's welcome Prof. Mark Belden.
Thank you, Indah, and thank you for the introduction as well as for the invitation. And thank you to the organizers too for organizing this conference and inviting me to speak. I'm looking forward to sharing some of my work on cosmopolitanism and humanities and social sciences, education and research. So I think you can see my slides. Is that right, Indah? Everything's okay?
Yes, everything
okay,
is clear.
thank you. So just to give you an overview and a little bit of a roadmap of what I'd like to share this morning is I'd like to talk a little bit about Cosmopolitan social practices, and so try to highlight these as everyday practices that I think can help us think about both education as well as research in humanities and the social sciences. I'll talk a little bit about cosmopolitan traditions in Asia and draw on the work of one key scholar mainly, because we won't have time to spend as much time as I'd like on that, but it's in the paper that you'll be able to read hopefully at some point. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about grand challenges of the 21st century and how we might mobilize cosmopolitan theory and practice in terms of helping us think about how we might collectively and at local levels as well think about those grand challenges and start to address those really complex interconnected issues. And then I'm going to talk about some new approaches in education and research, and then wrap things up as a conclusion. And I think I have 30 minutes, so I'll just take a look at the time now to make sure I stay within the time allotted. So if we think about cosmopolitan social practices, one of the things that I'd like to highlight is I think it's useful to think about these as social practices, as everyday practices that we try to enact in our various settings, whether it's in the classroom or whether it's in our communities. I know cosmopolitanism has a very rich theoretical and conceptual background, but I think it's also important to think about these as practices that we can, enact on a daily basis pretty much. And so if we look at them, I've highlighted 4 here, and I think these are kind of 4 key ones. I mean, this is based on, as Inda said, a new book that I have out with Tracy Alvear Martin that looks at global citizenship education in Asian contexts. And so we have chapters on educators doing things that, working with indigenous communities, for example, in the Philippines, where we see classrooms working with the Lumad in the Philippines. We see examples of LGBTQ issues being discussed in Taiwan, for example. Singaporean teachers working around using literature to talk about migrant issues, migrant workers, living conditions and work conditions in Singapore, and so on. And so these, I think, are some examples of that. There's also the Asia Pacific Journal of Education ran a special issue in 2020. It was edited by Faisal Rizvi and Suzanne Chu. Tracy and I have an article in there, but this is, I think, a good resource as well, because they really take a look at some of the different traditions across Asia. So, for example, the Soka movement in Japan, Tagore's cosmopolitanism in India. There's also an article on Islamic cosmopolitanism by Iqbal Hussein. And so it's a good chance to, I think, become a bit more familiar with some of the work in the region. But let me just highlight these 4 very quickly, and then we'll move on. First of all, I think it's an ethical and political project, cosmopolitanism. So there's certain kinds of ethical obligations that we have to other people based on the fact that they're humans like us. And so it's recognizing that sort of common humanity. And this also means that we have particular kinds of political obligations as well, that we work with others to struggle for human rights. We especially pay attention to the vulnerable in our societies, to those that need social justice issues to be addressed in the larger society, in terms of thinking about some of the systemic and kind of structural injustices that people face, whether they're indigenous peoples in certain countries or minority groups, different kinds of vulnerable populations. It's also premised on an idea of pluralism and multi-perspectivalism that takes a look at the benefits of living in plural societies. And so it works to maintain that pluralism and diversity in societies. I've already mentioned the work for social justice. And I think 2 key practices that we focus on in our book, for example, are opening up classroom spaces for greater dialogue and deliberation, where public issues are being discussed and deliberated. Students at all levels have opportunities to really talk about what different issues mean to them, how they how these issues might impact them personally and in their communities, and then deliberate over what should be done. You know, what course of action should we take to address some of these kinds of issues? I want to draw on the work of Khairuddin Al-Junaid, who's a friend and a colleague, who's a professor of Malay Studies at the National University of Singapore. And if you haven't read this book, I think, you know, I think this is a good starting point to go into his work. He's also written a book about Hamka and cosmopolitan reform in Southeast Asia, especially in Indonesia. But Khairuddin talks about this rich tradition of cosmopolitanism in the Straits of Malacca, in the Malay world, throughout really Southeast Asia. That again, kind of, I think, resonates with how I think about cosmopolitanism in the sense that it's grounded in local and everyday social relations that value pluralism. There's a certain kind of openness in the region, I think, that and also a tolerance and respect for difference that's resulted in this very rich hybridity across the region. We see this, I think, in Peranakan culture as well, in Singapore and in Southeast Asia. It's also a set of everyday practices that he says are very much aligned with, you know, the central tenets of Islam. You know, notions of compassion, justice, consensus, really working towards a common good. And so he defines it as a style of thought, the habit of seeing the world, a way of living that's really rooted in the central tenets of Islam, that everyone is part of this common humanity and accountable to God and morally responsible towards one another. So again, it's kind of an ethical project and a political project as well. There's rich traditions of this, I think, in Southeast Asia, as well as across all of Asia, pretty much. And it really means that we collaborate, we work with each other, we care. And so I think these principles, again, have application in terms of education and research that I want to touch upon. So that's a brief introduction, I think, just to some of the work that I've done and others have done that highlight some of these social practices that I think are really important for thinking about how we live together and work together to address some of the problems that we face, again, collectively. So I want to move now, and again, as we move into the 21st century grand challenges part of the talk here, try to think about how cosmopolitanism might support our work and education, our research and education around some of these very complex, interconnected issues that we're facing. Again, they're multi-scalar in the sense that we experience these at local levels, and it's important to work at the local level to address these. But we also see them as issues that are affecting us in the nation, as well as the region and globally. And so just to give you some examples, and there's a few here that we could talk about, but climate crisis, I would put, is the number one issue that we need to really wrestle with here very urgently. Because climate crisis is a threat multiplier. It exacerbates, it worsens all of the other kinds of social problems that we see, whether it's inequality or resource shortages or different kinds of political and ideological extremism, some of the populist movements that we see, especially across the world, right-wing populism, for example, and some of the security issues as well. And so if we look at these grand challenges, just to define these, they are multi-causal. They're quite complex in terms of their causality, the multiple causes. They're also multi-scalar, as I just mentioned. They cut across different kinds of temporal and spatial contexts, and they're highly interconnected. So they're interrelated. Inequality is related to climate crisis, for example. We see the most vulnerable populations being the most adversely affected. And we see the wealthiest populations of the global north are the ones who are emitting the greatest amount of carbon emissions. And so there's these, kind of, they cut across each other. There's this intersectionality that I think is important to examine. And they're multidisciplinary and boundary crossing. This is why multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary work is so important, because it enables us to really work with other people to help us better understand and be able to address these. They involve multiple stakeholders, sometimes with conflicting agendas. So it includes the business community, members of the business community and entrepreneurs, people that are working in technologies. It includes policymakers, obviously, but it also includes us as educators and researchers looking at societies. And really, these are issues that aren't going to go away. They need to be managed, and we need to find ways to manage them. And I was trying to think about the role of history and social sciences in this. And I think I studied under Christopher Lasch, who was a social historian at the University of Rochester when I was an undergraduate there. And he wrote about history as social criticism, that we use the past, we use history, the study of history, to really help us think more critically about the present and really think about kind of the historical roots. How did we arrive at this particular time and place with some of the challenges that we face? And so I think, that's important to think about, and to think about historians and social scientists as public intellectuals who can inform, citizens and broader society and policymakers and so on. So if we think about some of these grand challenges, there's some examples out there, and I'll be glad to share the slides so that you can refer to these and go into these in a little bit more in depth. But the Stanford Graduate School of Education, NIE has been looking at these pretty closely in terms of some of the grand challenges in education, for example. So really thinking about how do we harness technology that in ways that are more equitable, for example. How can we harness technology to especially reach those who are most vulnerable, who I think don't have access in some cases, right? And then thinking about these systems of education, how do we harness data around this? How do we make sure research and practice kind of work together? Kind of that research practice nexus. So these are kind of lingering problems in education. If we look at the University College London, they've identified several grand challenges, and I think what some universities are trying to do is to mobilize the resources in both research and education towards really addressing these grand challenges. So, justice and equality, more transformative forms of technology, global health, sustainable cities, cultural understanding, and human well-being are the ones that they've identified. If we look a little bit closer to home here, you'll see that NTU has just recently identified 4 grand challenges that they want to focus research and their teaching and learning on. And those are, what are the ways that we can mitigate our impact on the environment? Again, moving towards more sustainability research, sustainability education. What are the ways that we can harness science, art, and the technology of learning? So we at NIE are really focusing on the science of learning, but there is also an art of teaching and learning that we shouldn't forget. And we really need to think about how technology can support both kind of the science and art of learning. And then addressing technology's impact on humanity. And again, this requires critical perspectives that I think can be drawn from the social sciences, especially. We have historians of technology at NTU who look at kind of the history of technology and do really interesting work around, the harms that technology have brought, because they can be quite disruptive. They disrupt particular kinds of lifestyles and values and so on. We're moving into a high-tech era of automation and artificial intelligence and big data, algorithms and things like this. So we really need to think through, how we can sort of manage technology in some ways, and how can we use technology to support, again, the impact that we're making on our environment, for example, in terms of climate change. And then, how do we respond to the needs of a healthy living and aging across the lifespan? So if you want to go more into this, you can see the 4 core pillars that NTU has identified. Again, they see this as an effort in terms of educational practice, in terms of what goes on in classrooms and getting graduates future ready. And in Singapore, really trying to move beyond grades, which has been challenging. But it's how do we help people recognize the meaning and purpose of education in a broader sense? And then research obviously is important. What is the high impact research, not just for academic publications, hopefully, but actually social impact. So I think this notion of social impact is going to become more and more important as we move forward. And then thinking more about innovation and community. I think the community is, again, one of the things that I'm hoping that cosmopolitan principles and practices can support is, how do we work together around research, around education and innovation as more of a community? And if you go to the website here, if you just do a Google search for NTU Grand Challenges, you can see kind of the NTU vision and what they've sort of laid out as the pillars and different indicators and so on that you might want to refer to as you think about your own work. Again, this is, I think, quite complex because some of these issues are actually quite complex, but it really requires us to think about a more coordinated and more concerted effort across different disciplines, but even working more closely outside of academia, working more with entrepreneurs, working more with policymakers, practitioners across all walks of life. In my case, it's working with teachers, but also with people in different government agencies, artists, I think, social activists, NGOs. This kind of work, we're starting to see we need to kind of cross boundaries in the kind of work that we do. So I wanted to share, since this conference is really focused on new approaches in research and education, I wanted to just focus on a few things that I think might be important to start thinking about, or I know that you're probably already thinking about a lot of this, but to start thinking about how to move into this. And I think this is where NTU is at as well, and NIE. But how do we support cross-cutting work? How do we support this sort of multidisciplinary, multi-scalar, across different sectors that I just mentioned? How do we support that? What are some new methods? I wanted to share a sandpit approach. Participatory action research is not a new method. But I think more collaborative designs. We need to think about more collaborative research designs where we are working with partners. There's a couple of integrative structures that I'll share and talk a little bit about community engagement and partnerships, and then really spend some time talking about the co-production of knowledge and how we can work with diverse others. Again, thinking about this principle and practice of pluralism and what that might mean in our teaching and research. So if we think about cross-cutting work, I think again, we've already heard that multiple perspectives are important. This means more multidisciplinary collaborations. A good place to start is having historians and social scientists, sociologists, geographers working together, but also thinking about how do we work with communities outside of the university, as well as policymakers, entrepreneurs, and so on. One of the things that's helpful and I'll share an article that I think is really helpful around sandpits that uses a communities of practice approach and really focuses on how do we mutually engage each other. So if I work in education and do educational research, how might I work with historians? How might I work with social scientists around different kinds of contemporary issues that I want my students to engage with and to fully understand? What might that sort of mutual engagement look like? And what's the nature of the joint enterprise? What would be our outcomes? Do we have shared outcomes? How do I make sure that if it's focused on education, that you're also meeting outcomes in terms of your own research expertise, research area, and then shared repertoires? So typically in each of the disciplines, we tend to think of them as having different, people ask different kinds of research questions. They look at different kinds of problems. They have different methodologies in terms of data that they look at and how they analyze that data and work with it. And then a lot of times they report or share their findings in different ways. In geography, a lot of times it's much more maybe reports and more quantitative mixed methods sometimes. How do we start to have common or shared repertoires? And then really thinking about dialogue and deliberation is one way to do this kind of work in a community of practice. It requires this sort of ongoing discussion, dialogue, negotiation of practices and repertoires. Here's an example from India where we start to see this is a local problem that's looked at farmer suicides in a local area of India. And you can see that it's a multifaceted problem, and there's political dimensions to this, cultural, ecological, human, physical, social, and economic. And so this is a pretty nice paper. There's a link to it that looks at how they brought together different stakeholders, with different kinds of expertise to look at this problem. So it became a much more coordinated and concerted kind of focus on farming crisis and farmer suicides in particular. And so bringing in, people that are working in psychology, for example, or people who are policymakers, that maybe are going to look at more of the political and the social and economic aspects of this problem. It's a real tragedy in places, I think across the world in terms of how agriculture has been disrupted, especially by corporate agriculture and development. And so we see, farmers have had to move off the land, or they're not able to compete with these conglomerates. Here's another example. This is looking at human flourishing as again, a complex problem. And you can see the different things that are interrelated here: social life, cultural life, public life, the environment, and so on. So these are some examples. So I wanted to talk a little bit about a sandpit approach that I've been using in the Philippines with teachers to focus on the planning and teaching of controversial public issues. And so we worked with a group of about a little over 20 teachers who were selected by the University of Santo Tomas in Manila, which is the largest public university, I think, in the Philippines. And we met online and we used a sandpit approach. So this is from an article. Again, there's a link to this once you have the slides that you can look at. But day one, we had different titles. We called it Sandpit was the first kind of work that we had them do. The second was Synergize. So really kind of synergizing collaboratively, working collaboratively to kind of think about their public issue. And then to create. And the creation in this part was a lesson plan, unit plan, and also kind of a teaching plan that they did some micro teaching to kind of share with us how they would teach this in a classroom. So if you can see day one, it's explore, and it's really kind of exploring both the scope of the challenge, but also the kind of expertise. And it's bringing in people that can inform the problem or the challenge that you're interested in looking at. And again, evolving that sort of shared repertoire, the common language and methodology that might be used to address it. This is also drawn from the work of Maxwell and Benneworth, this idea of constructing new norms and repertoires to address these grand challenges. That's a really good article that I've been, I kind of draw on quite a bit actually in some of my own thinking. And then the second day, according to the Lodge, and this is I think what some of the things that they're doing in the United Kingdom, this idea really originally started in Norway in something called the Idea Lab, which was using a sandpit as a way to generate new ideas and to really revive the disciplines and to think more cross-disciplinary. The Innovate is really exploring the challenges using creative thinking techniques. And so it's using things like concept mapping or mind mapping, different kinds of workshops to really try to, again, I want to highlight that this notion of a sandpit is meant to be much more sort of playful, like a regular kid's sandpit. You come together and you kind of play with ideas a bit. It's meant to be less sort of stressful and so on. But it's bringing together the multidisciplinary people that can tackle the challenge and to kind of iterate ideas, to work ideas through different rounds of feedback, pitch those, get feedback, revise them, and so on. And then the last day is really focused around, creating and growing those ideas into a plan or a proposal that you can then pitch. So if we think about sandpits, just in summary, they're meant to be quite open, inclusive, safe, and like I said, playful. We kept stressing to the teachers, this is a safe space for you to really, express your concerns, and to be kind of playful in some of the ideas. But it's really designed to enable this sort of creative and deep exploration of multifaceted problems and ideas, and to draw on different perspectives and contributions that people can make. Another approach that you are maybe familiar with. I think probably the best example of participatory action research is in the work of Paulo Freire, a Brazilian educator who has, this is committed to social justice work with people, with diverse people. And it's focused on action, change, agency, and empowerment. And it's really grounded in particular contexts that are historical and socio-cultural, and really looking at kind of the shared experience of participants around a particular kind of challenge or problem. And so I think this is something too that points us towards more collaborative, participatory, more inclusive kinds of work that can start to advocate for change and move for change. So the research, not only is aimed at understanding the issue, but how do we resolve the issue? How do we address the issue in ways together, more collectively? Some integrative structures. This is from work in interdisciplinary work. Veronica Boye Mancia is from Harvard Project Zero, and she's done some really interesting work looking at higher education as well, and really studying the work that people who work together across disciplines do. And one of the things that she found is that they use conceptual bridges. So they use concepts, principles, theories to help fuse perspectives. So for example, I think systems theory is being used in the sciences. It's also being used in the social sciences. The notion, concepts like equilibrium or even transformation is something that we see cuts across different disciplines. The concept of networks is another example. I'll share some examples in our own work as well. The pragmatic approach is saying, okay, what do we really want to accomplish? It might be informing policy, but it's really focusing on the outcome. It could be products. It could be developing processes that people can use. This is often seen in urban planning, for example, where you bring together landscape architects, urban planners, geographers, people that do work in hydrology. How do we manage water use in the planning? Those kinds of things. So it can be also more pragmatic in terms of let's say what we want to be the set of intended outcomes, and then we work across our areas of expertise to really make sure we can deliver on those outcomes. So just to give some examples of this, in NIE, I was the PI of a signature programs in humanities project that developed two different labs. One was the historians lab, and you can see what we put together there. We had learning modules that we wanted teachers to use. We had video tutorials. One of the things that we wanted to do was to make disciplinary thinking, historical reasoning, more visible. And so we interviewed historians, how they do oral history, for example, how they address a particular kind of problem in history. We also worked with a game designer to develop games. We worked with tech specialists. Same thing with the Sustainability Learning Lab. We had videos, curriculum resources, pedagogical tools. We developed some really interesting things like a chronologer in history to help students think across time and space, so they could locate Singapore history within the history of the region as well as the history of the world, to look at what were the parallel kinds of developments happening when Singapore was focused on this. When Singapore was looking at independence, we see that this is the end of the Cold War. There's the post-colonial period. We see other countries are experiencing this and also kind of struggling with the Cold War. Some Cold War issues around communism as a potential threat to these newly developed nation states. So they start to see that in greater context and in chronology. The conceptual bridge. So one of the things I wanted to mention is that we worked. So we had historians, geographers, curriculum specialists like myself and Suhaimi Afandi, who's India's other supervisor for a PhD, who were working on curriculum and pedagogy. but also teachers. You know, we had history teachers and geography teachers involved. We worked with ICT and media specialists, especially around the videos. We worked with a game designer. That was really fun. We played games and developed games together. And we also worked with students on this. We had some of our NIE students working with us on the project. One of the conceptual bridges was Schulman's concept of signature pedagogies. And that idea is that there are particular ways of reasoning in the disciplines, you know, the ways historians think, write, talk, and work. And there's a pedagogy that supports that. So that was Lee Schulman. So that concept of signature pedagogies, that, in other words, we want the disciplines to inform how we educate teachers. So we were focused on teacher education, and we want students, whether at the secondary level or the university level, to also understand these ways of reasoning and thinking about the world. And so there's a pedagogy that supports that. And so we focused on pedagogies and curriculum resources. The other concept is one I already mentioned, and that's communities of practice. We saw this as a community of practice, and we saw that, you know, what we were doing with teachers was social and situated in the context of their work and so on, and also very pragmatic. There's an article, chapter in press that I'll share, and it looks like I'm getting close to the end of my time, so I'm going to move very quickly. As Inda mentioned, some of the work that I've done has been focused on partnerships and really looking at how we can work more collaboratively to make social impact and to build community capacity. In Singapore, since that's the context that I work in. But again, one of the principles that I want to highlight is in bold here, you know, it's grounded in local communities. And so being in schools, working with teachers is very important. And I think working with teachers to co-produce knowledge is important as well. And so hopefully you can see some of the cosmopolitan kind of principles in these principles, and then as well as some of the practices too. So really thinking about the relationship building. I think cosmopolitanism is fundamentally about relationships. And so building these relationships, forging partnerships, thinking more systemically, and then engaging in partnership through dialogue and deliberation with them. So these are some of the practices. Then I think this is the last one. And so really focusing on co-production of knowledge. And I really like this diagram. And I've been focused on co-producing knowledge with policymakers, between policymakers, teachers, and researchers at NIE, but also even external stakeholders. You know, like that project that I just shared, we worked with the Public Utilities Board around water. We were involved with the National Library and Heritage Board. We worked with the Drong Eco Garden Drong Town Council. So it's engaging people outside, but it's in that context, situating processes in a particular context, place or issue. It's, again, highly pluralistic. I think that's, again, coming back to cosmopolitanism, really understanding that there are different ways of knowing and doing that can inform the greater whole. And it's also goal-oriented, making sure that goals are clearly defined. And again, very interactive, more dialogical, more you know, participatory, and you know, around partnerships. And so co-producing knowledge is part of what we're trying to do with collaborative inquiry. So focusing on you know, classroom problems, for example, or educational problems with both policymakers and teachers. So just as a few closing remarks, one of the things that we drew on in our book, Tracy and I drew on, so really, it's really this idea of how might we transform education and research and use cosmopolitan practices to help us think about what we're doing. I think it goes back to really being clear about our purposes and our commitments to communities, especially to vulnerable communities, those that have been marginalized. I think that's a first order of doing this work that's based on cosmopolitanism and critical justice work. We drew on Quan Sheng Chen's book. He's a Taiwanese Asian studies scholar. His book called Asia as Method Toward De-Imperialization. He talks about interreferencing. In other words, move away from the West as these sort of notions, concepts, and practices, to really looking at more of the rich traditions in Asia and referencing those, looking across different contexts to see how people are drawing upon different traditions and practices to really think about these grand challenges. He also talks about critical syncretism, which is kind of blending. It's this sort of hybrid approach, which I think cosmopolitanism lends itself well to. It's about mixing different strategies and using different kinds of tools depending on what might best work. So critical syncretism that can start to challenge some of the colonial and imperialist kinds of practices in the region. And then multiplier frames of reference. So to me, this is the cosmopolitan principle of pluralism. And then, using this as a method to really, I think his book is, again, the subtitle is Toward De-Imperialization, but challenging colonial, neoliberal, and nationalistic discourses and practices that aims towards greater social justice. And I want to point to the Forces of Renewal in Southeast Asia group that's looking at issues of social justice in Southeast Asia that tries to bring together, I think they're a nice model of what I've been talking about today, where it brings together scholars, but also artists and activists and others, entrepreneurs, to really think about, gender issues, human rights, labor movements, indigenous movements and populations and their needs and so on. So I think it's a good site to take a look at. Some interesting work there, I think, being done by scholars across the region. I think if we, again, think about pluralism and multi-perspectival approaches, it's really about respecting diverse knowledges in ways that are more intergenerational, drawing on the wisdom of older generations, for example, but also listening to youth and their concerns, and the voice of youth is important, more ecological and indigenous. And then it's really commitments to local communities. And I'm highlighting the Aberdeen Manifesto, University of Aberdeen, where they very explicitly say that we are reclaiming our university. We're taking it back from these sort of neoliberal corporate market-driven forces that see students as consumers and knowledge as a commodity. And we are going to think more about the university's civic mission and our commitment to local communities and the kinds of social impact, rather than just producing publications and research to enhance university rankings. It's about doing more to actually benefit people that are around us in our communities. And then, think more about the capacities to co-create with diverse communities using dialogue and deliberation. So that is the end of my talk. And thank you very much for listening. And that I'll stop sharing so that, And if I guess, Inda, I don't know, are we doing Q&A now, or we wait until after the next keynote? How did you?
So we will do the Q&A for you right now. So thank you, Prof. Mark Bilden, for your excellent talk. And I really like the way you translate the theory of cosmopolitanism into practices, like, what you did with teachers and what was happening in NIE, NTU, and so on. And now we will give the floor to our participants here. You can raise questions by using the raise hand function, or you can write it in the chat box. Do we have something here? Okay, maybe while we are waiting for the question for participants, I want to ask you this question. I really like, the way you present about the co-production of knowledge, like you said in your example of the historians lab or the sustainability lab, and how you work with different stakeholders to build that. And I just want to ask you, do you have any challenges while you doing that? Because what you share is how to say, like the success story.
Yeah.
So how about, do you have any challenges to do that?
Yeah, I think one of the first challenge is just developing a shared vision of, you know, what this might look like and how people can participate in that vision. And I think that's an important first step. And I think sometimes it's maybe difficult to think about, you know, how does a historian see that they have something in common with a geographer, for example, because they're each doing kind of different work. So I think that shared vision was a first challenge, and I think we managed it. I think people bought into it. I think teachers were excited about it. The second challenge was, I think that the ICT challenge was quite, you know, I think quite an obstacle at first. We had educational ICT designers from NIE that worked on the Sustainability Learning Lab, and they knew what we were trying to do. So they were able to work with us and design technology that I think supported learning. With the historians lab, we had to outsource, and so we were using you know, private developers, designers, and they didn't get it at first. And so the first group that we paid money to wasn't doing what we wanted them to do, and then we had to find another group that could do. So it delayed the historians lab a bit, and I think, you know, as a result, you know, I think, you know, the historians lab is no longer up, and the sustainability learning lab is still going strong. And I think the other thing is, the other challenge is succession. I was the PI for that, and so the team was very happy to have me present to MOE, to present to different stakeholders, but they were a little bit, I don't know if maybe, and again, I think maybe this was the historians lab more than the sustainability lab. Maybe they weren't as passionate about what they had done to kind of sustain it and to kind of take it to the next, you know, the next level. But we do have some passionate geographers and geography educators, I think, that they're reviving it. They're looking at getting more money, because I guess the other challenge is you run out of money. we ran out of money. And so, you know, do we get more funding? We had a grand vision as well, and we went for about over $1 million, I think, and we made it to the final stage, and it got rejected because they wanted to see more evidence of what the initial project had, you know, accomplished, I think, in terms of student learning and teacher learning. So you've got to, I think, you know, make your case to the. We went through several rounds of presentation. We got to the permanent secretary round, and then they made the decision not to give us the $1 million. So, so funding is always a challenge. But we were gonna use augmented reality. I mean, we had these huge, you know, plans for technology kind of. So it would have been Historians Lab 2.0, Sustainability Learning Lab 2.0, which would have been really kind of more high tech. So, yeah.
Thank you, Mark. That's very interesting. I mean, here in our university, in Universitas Negeri Malang, we also have that kind of innovations in history education, and we have a lot of students researching about using the high-tech augmented reality, virtual reality. Maybe in the future, we can have more collaboration on this between ICHSE and history department over here.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I hope so. Yeah, yes. I think I wanted to share one of the keynotes that I gave not too long ago was with the University of United Arab Emirates University, but it was a joint conference with United Arab Emirates University, the University of Finland, and Education University of Hong Kong. So it brought three universities. I really like that because you get, you know, that sort of cross fertilization. I think it's very much aligned with sort of that cosmopolitanism, you know, but making those connections with people at NIE or NTU, I think is really, you know, really important. Like you mentioned. Yeah. I think that, you know, one of the issues with NIE is that we're so sort of focused on the Singapore system, you know, and kind of the Ministry of Education's needs that, but we benefit tremendously from these kinds of collaborations. I think everybody does. And so if we can make a case for that, that'd be great.
Okay, thank you. Now we have one question over here in the chat box. Let me read it. This is from Dinar Listia Putri from Universitas Negeri Surabaya. She asked how to avoid any polarization of opinions and standpoints, which could be naturally happen once we are addressing about controversial issues among people.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And that's one that I think, continually sort of wrestle with. And I think one of the things is that, it requires a certain kind of humility and sensitivity and respect for different positions. But I do think that, dialogue and deliberation can be, grounded on particular kinds of norms that enable people to work across difference. And one of the things that we talk a lot about is dialogue across difference, and how do we have those dialogues around difficult issues. One of the things that I'm working on a book right now, and we're looking at dialogue and deliberation. But what ends up happening is kind of the other side of what the questioner was getting at. And that is that sometimes marginalized voices are left out of the conversation. And you have this sort of narrow range of perspectives that are brought to the table. And so we're using a concept of counter narration. In other words, we need more voices. And I think when you do that, it actually, means, I think, the potential for polarization of opinions. And so I think the other thing that you have to account for is sort of the power dynamic in the conversation, and to make it explicit, and to address it, and to try to moderate that to some extent. I'm looking at polarization in the book that I'm working on, actually, and I think that one of the things that we're finding is it's around climate denial, the denial of climate change science. It's science denial, and it's mainly a Western phenomenon, I think, especially in the United States and Australia, UK, I think. But a lot of times the problem is that we see these messages coming about climate change that are both industry-led by the fossil fuel industry, and then politically motivated. And we're not including the voices of people from marginalized communities, indigenous communities, who are being the most impacted. And so sometimes we need to have that reality brought to the table. I think it's an ongoing struggle, but one of the things that we're focusing on is it's based on trust. To overcome that polarization is based on trust, and it's based on social relationships and building social relationships. And I think that we're very fragmented in American society, at least, and so we go into our own sort of echo chambers, and we don't talk much to each other anymore. And so really reestablishing greater social trust, I think, is important. But how do you avoid it? Yeah, I think it requires, so I guess just to kind of summarize a very long-winded response, I think it's build trust by building relationships so that people trust you, even if they have very different opinions. And then not focusing so much on the individual people, but the problem, and really thinking about how might these diverse, sometimes polarized views actually help us think about the problem in a productive way. And it requires people who are really good at facilitating, I think, dialogue and deliberation as well. So, and being aware of kind of the context and some of the sensitivities in those particular contexts. But it's a challenging, I think it's constantly, this is what we were working with the teachers in the Philippines about, how do we manage sensitive issues, especially when there's such polarized views. It's certainly something that we work with students in Singapore, student teachers in Singapore, teachers in Singapore with, and it's a problem, I think, in most contexts. Yeah, a lot of landmines, a lot of challenges. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I think we also have that kind of problems in Indonesia or Malaysia or any other parts of this region about the polarization and also, the control from the government.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's That's one of the problem. Do we have another question? Maybe you can just open your mic.
Arif, I think raised a hand.
Okay, Arif, yes, please unmute your microphone.
Maybe
yeah.
do you need to unmute him? Oh, okay.
Yeah, the host.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
Should do that.
Okay, thank you. Good morning, Pak Mark. Nice to hear your presentation. A very good presentation. What I want to say in this seminar is that the main character of History Department Universitas Negeri Malang, I'm the member of this department, is cultural history. I mean history of Singosari, Hindu or Buddhist temple like that. And then recent Indonesian historical or archaeological research run by some non-historian based academic community such as pecinta sejarah or something like that produce some what we call as pseudo history such as Gajah Mada, or Gajah Mada mean that some people try to reconstruct Majapahit as Islamic kingdom, or community or some people that said Borobudur temple was built by Nabi Sulaiman or Solomon king like that. Nah, I want to know how your opinion about this. While Indian post-colonial historian, we know some big name like Gayatri Spivak or something, some name like that. Success to build some Indian value. How post-colonial Indian reconstruct their history. But in Indonesia, maybe we fail to build some Indonesian value or Asian value to reconstruct our own paradigm of history. We in some case we praise what Orientalists found about our archaeological temple or what old manuscript like that. But in some case, in other hand, some community try to denying all knowledge produced by Orientalists, by Dutch scholar or by Orientalists. I mean, how Department of History in this case, in your opinion, deal with this case? I'm sorry if my English not so fluently. Thank you, Mbak Indah and committee.
Yeah, really. Yeah, thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, Arif.
So
Really,
I think he's asking about the pseudoscience within community, like the history lovers or people, local communities who has their own interpretation of history, their own way, which might be not as scientific as his disciplinary historian doing.
Yeah, and I think it's a similar challenge with some of the work that I'm doing around climate denial, that denies the science and the scientific consensus. I think one thing that I think is important is that we make explicit the knowledge or the epistemic standards that we work by, so that the broader community understands what constitutes valid and reliable knowledge. So it's sort of making more public the ways historians work and create knowledge that is sound, that has a basis in evidence. And I think that it's also exposing, I think, or sort of highlighting that this is knowledge that tries to account for error, that tries to take into account multiple perspectives, very different perspectives, and has to adjudicate those, has to kind of think about how do you synthesize or balance those different perspectives, or sometimes, you know, if the perspective isn't legitimate and valid, you know, on what grounds do you make those determinations? So I think one is sort of making more explicit the knowledge work and how you operate according to particular kinds of norms, practices, standards in your own work to make sure that knowledge is rigorous and sound. The second thing is to highlight the agendas somehow of others, because history is contested, and it's contested for a range of purposes. Sometimes it's because of religion and religious belief. Sometimes it's political, and it's around, you know, the politics of the past and how we want, how politicians or governments or officials might want people to think about the past and to remember the past. And I think, you know, it's acknowledging that it's contested, but that, you know, your motives for understanding the past are pure in some ways, in the sense that they're rigorous, it's based on evidence, and that these other perspectives are sometimes, you know, they have particular kinds of biases in terms of different kinds of agendas that are motivated sometimes by politics, or they're motivated by religion. But I do still think it goes back to what I was mentioning around, you know, so I think it's making more explicit some of this knowledge work, for one, and the nature of knowledge that we deal with as citizens and as a public, and the kind of work that historians do, which is, you know, based on it's a community of practice where you're testing each other, you're judging each other, you're you know, making sure that someone isn't publishing, for example, weak or false information about the past. But it's also a recognition that there's a lot of debate and contestation around these things, because there's different kinds of evidence and different sorts of perspectives that can be brought to bear. But I think it's just, you know, again, it's a matter of trust, building social relationships with policymakers and different communities. And I think it comes down to basically a matter of persuasion, and you know, being able to put forward your evidence and your views in the best possible way, so that others can understand that they're not threats necessarily, that they can coexist somehow. It's a tricky, I think it's a tricky issue, but it's a great, those are great questions. And I think those are real questions that I think we struggle with all the time, but it's a continual, I think, just trying to be as persuasive as you can with the people involved in kind of the debate, the ongoing debate and the controversy. Yeah, it's the best we can do, I guess. One thing that we find in climate science is that climate scientists have not made their work very accessible to the public. So there's a lot of confusion, a lot of misinformation, and this is everything around climate, but it's also COVID. You know, I think public officials and scientists in the United States, at least, didn't do a very good job of kind of helping citizens and the public understand, you know, what this pandemic meant and what it was about. And so then you see these groups that are really kind of exploiting that and spreading all kinds of information, very intentional, you know, disinformation at times. So I think it's, you know, so we have to be, to some extent, public intellectuals. And I think in Singapore, and Inda knows this person well, Farish Noor, who is on her committee, is an example of a public intellectual. He publishes in the Straits Times and in other you know, journals that are more for a public audience. And so I think we have to do that as well. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you.
I've lost track of time, Inda, so I'm hoping you're keeping track of time.
Yeah, it's okay. We still have more time, because previously we skipped something. Okay. But anyway, we have one more question. I think this will be the last question for this session. This one is from our student. Her name is Mahilda. And she wants to ask about what was the biggest, or what is the biggest obstacle you think when discussing a controversial issue in history? When was the important, and maybe they have personal opinions, or I don't know. Okay, so I think it's about teaching controversial issue, and this reminds me of one of your edited book previous years ago, teaching controversial history in Asia context.
Oh yeah, I forgot about that.
That's the book that led me to you, actually.
Okay.
I read your work from there, and yeah, I think that's very interesting. You have a lot of researchers on that area discussing about controversial history. And I think in Indonesia, we also have a lot of these controversial history problems, and maybe you can share your research about this, about
yeah.
discussing.
Well, I don't know if it's, yeah, I don't know if it's research as much as it is just sort of practical experience in Singapore, where history, like in other countries, is contested, and there's official versions that educators are expected to kind of teach. And so sometimes it's quite sensitive and controversial to introduce different perspectives that maybe are more critical of the Singapore narrative and sort of that official history. But I think that, you know, I think that there's a really nice, I guess one researcher is referred to it as contained risk-taking. You know, you keep it within, you need to know boundaries, and you need to be kind of sensitive to those, and you need to be fairly tactful in how you address some of these controversial issues. It isn't anything goes, and this is true in any context. Even, you know, I mean, especially in the United States now, where you can get into some really big trouble with people who are kind of monitoring what gets taught, especially in social studies around critical race theory, and in history classrooms as well. There's been whole, like Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States has been basically banned in some school districts, and I think in some states even. So they're really trying to force this sort of official history on teachers and students. And so I think, you know, she asked about what was the greatest obstacle. And I think sometimes it's these sort of official narratives. And I think it's also the officials themselves who we have to be careful of. I think teachers sometimes are worried that they might get into trouble with their you know, administrators, whether they're principals or, but I think, again, this is where I find that if you can build trust, I think one of the things that I have been able to do in Singapore, for example, is to build trust with the Ministry of Education. And so one thing that I did a few years ago is I had these symposia around controversial issues. And I would always invite 3 speakers, and it would be someone who is an academic, people like Farish Noor, Yu Yen Tio, who spoke about inequality, someone who is also a government official, so maybe with one of the agencies, with population policy, for example, I had someone that had written the white paper on population policy that was quite controversial back a few years ago. So always those 2. And then the third was always a civil society activist. So people who had actually gotten into trouble, is people who had worked for AWARE, which is women's rights organization. I invited people who had worked on migration worker issues, who had gotten in trouble and had actually, and also human rights issues, people who had been working on inequality. And the ministry came to me and said, you know, we're really nervous about this, you know, and I said, it'll be fine. It'll be fine to have these 3 perspectives, to have civil society activists, people from NGOs also talk with, and it ended up being really great. And I think, you know, the one person, they said, you know, Mark, can you go talk to him and tell him to be careful because these are teachers? And I did. I went and talked to the person who I knew, and I said, you know, look, you know, MOE asked me to come talk to you. Just understand that there's a little sensitivity. He goes, I know. He was great. He really connected with the teachers. He said, I'd be glad to come in and talk to your students. And I think what happened is the officials, I think, saw that, yeah, this can be managed without it being, you know, something that will corrupt our youth, or, you know, but I think it's based on that sort of level of trust, and I think it's also being fairly tactful and not saying things that are outlandish. I think you have to. So I think one of the obstacles means that we just have to. I wouldn't call it self-censorship so much, but we have to really think carefully about what we say and how we say it, and we have to have some awareness of the sensitivity and the context. But I've done a lot of seminars with teachers around controversial issues, in Singapore, and I find that if you do it in a fairly honest, straightforward, authentic way, and to say, look, these are issues that are being debated in public. These aren't my positions necessarily, but they're positions. We did a whole thing around Operation Cold Store, and we had students read. So the debate was, whether Lee Kuan Yew basically rounded up the communists as a way to get rid of opposition, or whether there was a genuine security threat to the early nation, right? And so this is a debate that was taken up in public by historians like P.J. Thum and Kumar Ramakrishnan. And so we had students read what they had written and just said, look, this is a debate that we're seeing in public right now. Where do you stand on this position? We didn't tell students where to stand on the position, but it was still seen as quite, I think a lot of teachers shied away from taking that on. They were nervous about it. But I think we spend a lot of time talking about how, there's different positions that teachers can take to help facilitate and manage these controversies. And so one is you can be neutral, one is you can play devil's advocate and kind of, push students thinking and saying, hey, this isn't my thinking necessarily. I'm sharing what other people think. And you need to be able to respond to that and think about the arguments either for or against that. Or you can also, I think it's helpful for students to, I think sometimes I make visible my thinking. Well, this is how I think about it. And they need to see models of reasoning sometimes. And, you do it in a way that's, again, tactful and I think respectful. And I think that's, but I think the biggest obstacle perhaps is, the fear that I think both officials have, as well as teachers and kind of all of us have, around doing this. But I do think that it can be kind of navigated. Yeah. So hope that was helpful. It takes courage. It takes courage, I think. And also, being tactful and to try things out. And I think the danger is sometimes you can be misinterpreted in the classroom. Like you might say something and maybe a student tells a parent and then the parent. So I think you just have to, I think the other thing is you really have to be able to justify and kind of rationalize why you are doing this with students. It's saying to them, look, these are issues they will face as citizens. It's better if they address this in the classroom. I remember a teacher asking Farish Noor at one of these symposium, they said, one of the teachers got up and said, Prof, my students are bringing in these videos of terrorists who burned this pilot. I don't know if you remember the case. I think it might have been in Afghanistan. I forget where it was. And wanted to talk to me about it. And I was really nervous about whether I should talk about this. And he said, look, if you don't talk about this with that student and help that student make sense of it somehow, who knows? There's a lot of people out there also grooming young people for particular kinds of things, right? Online. But they need to be, we need to help them think about these things and help them have the tools to be able to resist some of these kinds of propaganda messages that are coming at them from, various sources. And so his advice was, you take it on directly. You don't shy around it. You just, you confront it kind of. You address it right up front instead of, being quite nervous and cautious about it. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I think that will be the end of this session. Thanks again to Professor Mark Belden for the wonderful talk and discussion. And now we are going to move to our second talk in this session. Let me introduce our second speaker. Dr. Francis M. Navarro pursued higher studies at the Universidad de Salamanca as scholar of the Spanish government, where he took his doctorate archival management and documentation. He is currently an associate professor of history at Ateneo de Manila University, where he teaches and does research on Philippine history, result studies, Hispanic and Trans-Hispanic histories. He was awarded in 2018 by San Beda College, where he finished his elementary and high school education as the most outstanding pedant in the field of arts and culture. At the moment, he is the coordinator of the Philippine Academic Consortium for Latin American Studies. In this session, Prof. Navarro will give a talk titled Using and Understanding the Importance of Archives Through Paleography, the Case of the Philippines. Prof. Navarro, the time is yours.
Thank you very much, Ms. Indaw Tami, for introducing me. Salamat pagi dari Manila. I would like to thank the organizers of this conference for the invitation extended to me from the Department of History, the Faculty of Social Sciences, and also special thanks to Professor Ronald Ridoy, who invited me to participate in this conference of yours at the university. Well, thank you very much. Well, I listened intently to what Professor Mike Baldwin talked about earlier, and I could actually say that I totally agree with him. And with regards to in the area of historical studies, there are so many similarities that can be seen as well in the Philippines. Well, let me start by sharing my screen, and well, I will be as a practicing. I'm so sorry. Can you see my screen? Wait a minute. Go again.
No, it's not on the screen yet.
There we go. There. Is that okay?
Yes, we can see your PowerPoint, but I think there's some problem with the sound.
Can you hear me well? Okay.
Yes,
Okay.
it's better now. Thank
Okay,
you.
thank you very much. Well, as a practicing archivist as well and records manager, together with my work as a historian, as a student of history, as I would say it, well, I've been very much involved in the education of students and also of the public with regards to the use of the archives now in terms of the importance of our records, not only in the study of our history from the past, but also in the present, and of course the archives is the soul of every nation, as I would tell them, because that is where the records of our history are located. And well, between Indonesia and the Philippines, we have so much similarities in common as well, passing through a period of colonialism. In the case of the Philippines, we passed through more than 300 years of Spanish colonial rule, and then later on 50 years of American colonial rule. As we say jokingly, we have 350 years of convent rule and 50 years of Hollywood. Okay, and so that is our relationship with our colonial history. And so I would like to talk about the importance of the archives for every student, for every researcher, and not just for the historian, but for anyone looking into the area of the social sciences and looking at the major primary sources that are available. And I would like to share with you the case of the Philippines. Well, one of my major areas also of concern, of course, in the Philippines now, is that not everyone speaks Spanish anymore. Okay, and it's only a certain percentage of the population that speaks Spanish. And one of the major problems that historians and students of history or any researcher would face always in the use of the archives, where we have millions and millions of documents written in Spanish. during the 350 years of Spanish colonial rule is how to understand these documents. And so in the area of paleography, which is not widely taught in the Philippines except in major universities like, as mentioned by Professor Baldwin earlier, the University of Santo Tomas, which is the oldest university of Asia, founded in 1611, okay, where even up to now, Spanish is still being taught at the university level. So paleography is something that researchers would need in order to understand these documents. And what does it mean? It simply means reading ancient texts with accuracy. Secondly, to date and localize their handwriting, as such as it is an important major component of two other more complex disciplines, that is diplomatic history, the study of the manuscript itself, which studies all aspects of documents and records, and of paleography, which studies all aspects of books produced by hand. Okay, so we are looking at records actually transferred, okay, from one paper to the other, made copies for various offices of the government, and then archived. Okay, so if you look at its history, it's actually what? Study of ancient handwriting. And as we still moved into the 21st century, paper is still a very important aspect of our record keeping, even though as we move towards the digitalization of our records, the origin is still in paper. Okay, the original is still on paper. Well, I'm not quite familiar in the case of Indonesia in terms of your records, as that is one of my, how would I say, list in my bucket list to visit, and that is to see and visit the archives in Indonesia and Malaysia, Malaysia, and Singapore. And as I've said earlier, well, since the majority of our documents would be written in Spanish, and lately when the Americans came, in English, and even up to now, you know, maybe the Philippines would be quite an interesting place to study, because until 1988 we had 3 official languages. We had Filipino, our language, we had English, and we also had Spanish. Also, all of this were taught at the university. But after 1988, Spanish was taken off from the list, and so now we just have 2 official languages. But there is now a move to bring back Spanish now into the curriculum, simply because of our growing ties again with the former mother country, that is Spain, and of course across the Pacific with Latin America, no, with South American countries. Not only increasing our cultural and historical bonds with them, but also improving our ties economically and politically with these nations across the Pacific. Okay, so as in any student of history studying documents, whether it would be in Spanish or in Dutch or in Bahasa, for example, especially for the foreigner, okay, I would always suggest first that researchers using the archives should have a good knowledge of the language in which the document is written. Now, in the case of the Philippines, as I've said earlier, not everyone speaks Spanish anymore, but there is a growing segment of society studying the language, and many of our students now in the social sciences, especially in the Department of History, are now taking Spanish and are able at least to have a reading knowledge of the documents. Okay. Now, second would be familiarizing oneself with the writing materials used during the chronological period under study. And with regards to the Philippines, ever since Spanish colonization started in 1565, though we were more or less discovered, and I put it in in quotation, no, that when they arrived in 1521, Spanish colonization actually started only in 1565. Okay, and at that particular moment in our history, well, as you see in the history of the time, okay, Europe was passing through a period also. You have the Reformation, the ending of the medieval period, but still, okay, crossing the wide area of the world and crossing the seas, okay. Whatever knowledge was taken from there and brought to the Philippines stayed here. Third is to be able to identify the different handwriting styles, which is actually a challenge to us. And again, you know, I think in terms of the history of Indonesia and Malaysia, where Bahasa or is widely used, you know, I mean, it's the national language of the country. And then, of course, you have the so-called Dutch colonial records existing in the archives. Well, in the case of the Philippines, not only do we have to contend with Spanish, we also have to contend with the various language writing styles of the Spanish language between the 16th all the way up to the 19th century. And of course, the issue of abbreviations, and of course, as I would always tell my students and in my lectures to records managers and archivists and those doing historical research in the archives, of course, each document would be signed and would be written by a different writer. Okay, and of course, that would, in a way, although you are looking at the same document, okay, the same words would be used. Okay, it's the writing of the individual scribe that you would have to decipher, okay, later on if they are not understandable. Okay, now in the Philippines, as I've said earlier, as most of our documents are in Spanish. Okay, well, most of the documents have what you might call the same more or less pattern of writing. And just to show you this, for example, what is a typical Spanish record in the Philippines, it is always actually divided into what you call the introduction, what we call the protocolo at the beginning, where you would be able to see where the document would be coming from. Second would be the body of information as written down there. And then, of course, what is important here are the seals, because it establishes the origin of the document. Okay, the origin of the document. Well, whenever my students would ask me, for example, sir, why is it that we see the same document? We see the same document in different piles, but written by a different person, but it's about the same, it's practically the same document. And of course, I would jokingly tell them, well, first of all, there was no such thing as a photocopying machine at that time. And definitely, documents were passed on from one office to the other by hand, by making copies of it, okay, and then being archived in that particular office and then passed on to the next office. Remember that the Spanish Empire at the time was very bureaucratic, that even when I was a graduate student in Spain, I would spend hours and hours inside an archive looking at the same bundle of documents, because I would always experience the same thing, that I was reading the same document over and over again. Okay. And in the case of the Philippines, and we share the same climate as well with Indonesia and Malaysia, one of course, our documents would be written in paper, and definitely the climate and the temperature in this part of the world would definitely affect the status of our paper. And so it would depend on the archive then to preserve and conserve these documents, especially under the circumstances that we are in, that humidity, and of course, aside from the issues regarding climate, we also have issues regarding the rains, regarding what you might call the so-called issues with rodents, okay, the major enemies of paper. And that is why, whether it's parchment or vellum, or actually, as I've said, as I am saying now, also using skin as paper, for example, If they are not properly preserved and conserved, then they will actually simply wither away. And as I mentioned earlier, the millions of documents in the Philippine archives would actually be records and histories of individual provinces and the history of the churches. Okay, how, for example, smaller histories like how did Filipinos, for example, started using Spanish surnames, okay, to replace our old traditional names as mandated by law. So everything is actually recorded in the archives. So as I've said, paper, vellum, okay, all of this actually would suffer definitely under varying temperatures, under varying climates, if they are not actually taken care of. And in the Philippines, during the Spanish colonial period, okay, when paper was no longer being imported from Spain and local manufacturers were actually using paper, we were using the mulberry tree or the lapnis, which is the traditional paper used by ancient Filipinos, okay. And of course, it would also suffer the same problem as any document in the archives, and that is if they are what you might call that, if they are attacked by rodents, fire, for example, or water. And of course, the number one, another very important enemy of our archives or the paper would be us, we ourselves, humans, no? If we do not properly take care of them, or if not, they are left actually simply to wither away in the archives and not to be preserved for future use. Also, as a matter of introducing students in history in the Philippines with regards to the use of the documents, okay, they have to understand that under also the issue of temperature and climate in the country, of course, we also look into the ink, which is actually, well, an important aspect of preserving these documents with regards to understanding what is the kind of ink used. And I think the same thing would be found in the colonial archives and records in Indonesia and Malaysia and Singapore, you know, whether you have the British and the Dutch and the Spanish and the Philippines, practically using the same materials in terms of writing. Okay, so going back again to problems related to research in the case of the Philippines, first would be the issue of reading knowledge of the Spanish language. Okay. Although the majority of the Filipinos have more or less lost the capacity to speak Spanish, although there are hundreds and thousands of Spanish words in the Philippine language. Okay. Well, it is still, how would I say, not very useful in reading Spanish at all. So a good reading knowledge of Spanish would be very helpful for any student of Philippine history. Okay, so that is one very important point here. Second would be abbreviations. Okay, well, in the Philippines, our records until 1898, for example, until the Americans came, they were all written in Spanish and partly in Latin. And later on, I will show you even the kind of handwriting that was used to understand these documents. So students should be familiar with the abbreviations that would be used. And in my research and in some of the works I've done to teach our students to understand Spanish, I've come up with materials, learning materials and books, editing books on understanding Spanish abbreviations and Latin abbreviations found in the Spanish documents. Third would be how translating it from the original text. So as I've said, we are going back to the first issue, that is understanding Spanish, okay, and knowing how to read it. And of course, a major issue that we are facing right now in the Philippines is the deterioration of our documents. Okay, well, there is an active project now to give our National Archives its permanent home because it has always shared space with the National Library. And for the first time in our more than 500 years of history, we are finally having a permanent place for our documents, which is now being being constructed now at the old city of Manila. Now, interesting also is that, well, in many of these documents, and as you see here in this slide that I'm showing, you have here, well, it's written in Spanish, a paleographic guide of the Philippines. And this particular writing style is still used up to now, unfortunately only by a small percentage of the people, especially in the what you call in the indigenous, among the indigenous people of the country. And we called it baybayin, and many of them still exist even up to now, side by side with the Spanish documents. So we are not only hampered by the use of the Spanish language, but also with the study of the old writing style used by ancient Filipinos, which we have lost for so many years because later on, when the Spanish replaced our old alphabet with with the new Latin alphabet, we practically lost all of this. And it is important to know that, well, this is something that we are trying to redeem now. Okay, and this is more or less, the work of not only of historians but social scientists in the Philippines and maybe in any country in Southeast Asia for that matter. And I'm looking at the period from the point of colonialism, when a large segment of one's country's history was lost and its culture lost and replaced by what you call it, the superior culture of the conquering country. Okay. And to give you an example, the first book ever printed in the Philippines was actually a book on catechism, teaching Filipinos how to be Christians. And this one was in 1593, printed in Manila. One of the, a few of these books are actually found in existence. I discovered two in Spain and one in the Philippines and one in the United States. And it's a book published in order to teach Christianity or catechism to Filipinos and also to the local Chinese community. Okay. And so another book that would later on also be considered one of the earlier books as well, printed in the country, would be a book on catechism, but printed in Chinese, because there was also a large Chinese population existing in the Philippines prior to the coming of the Spaniards. And to give an example of what is written in the book, just for historical reasons, and I hope you will grant me this short explanation, is that you will see on the left side, more or less, the Spanish way of the Spaniards' policy of introducing the Latin alphabet, okay, and replacing the old writing of the ancient Filipinos. And on the other side, you will see already a translation from the Spanish into Tagalog or Filipino of a Spanish prayer by using already the Latin alphabet, okay, the Spanish alphabet. Okay, so more or less, okay, you will see already how our culture would be replaced by a conquering culture. Okay, and this is basically what would happen for us for more than 300 years. Okay, now the documents in the Philippines would vary, and I'll be showing you some examples of documents, whether in their good condition or unfortunate condition. And this one is a document of an example of a Spanish document, one of the millions found in the Philippine archives from 1883. And this is part of what a collection we call, part of a collection we call Elección de Pueblos, or the beginning of the towns, because the Spanish started building towns by putting all the people together from their so-called old households and putting them into towns. And so this is what the Spanish would call as reducción, or reducing the population later on into smaller towns. Okay, and later on these towns will become big towns. Some of them later on will become cities. Okay, and you will see also, okay, as I've mentioned earlier, one of the main issues faced by our researchers will always be understanding the document. So if I may go to the previous one, okay, still understandable, very legible to read, okay, and the same here, okay, and for many students of history in the Philippines, a knowledge of written Spanish would be, okay, would be very, very helpful, okay. And of course, together with a very good dictionary, we will be able to decipher the entire document. But what about documents like this? And this is a very, what you call that, very useful document, because it's a document of a town up in the northern part of Luzon, north of Manila, okay? And just to show you how some of our documents have actually more or less deteriorated. But again, you know, documents like this, like maps, are very important, especially in the study of local history. Well, there is a very strong interest now among students and among researchers to do local history, because as we say, you know, the Philippine history still is incomplete, because most of our history before 1945 was written from the point of view of foreigners. And it was only after 1945 that Filipino historians started to write our history from their own point of view, okay, from how they looked at it. And what better way to look at it by looking at the old primary documents. In the Philippines, there are many places to do research. And just to let you know, we, in some of our archives in the Philippines, there have been records found of documents relating to migration of people from Malacca, from Timor, for example, towards the Philippines. So you see, there is a shared history in some way with regards to our archival collection with Indonesia. So in the Philippines, we have the National Archives located in Manila, and this is where most of the millions of documents are to be found. But aside from the public archives, we have what you call our religious archives, especially from the religious orders that started their work in the Philippines as early as the 1560s. And because of that, their records, like the Dominicans at the University of Santo Tomas, as I mentioned, the oldest university in the Philippines, founded in 1611, okay, still houses a very, very good collection of the missionary work of the Dominican fathers. We also have the Ayala Museum located at Makati, which is privately owned, and it houses a very good collection of ancient Philippine gold that were discovered by the Spanish. And then also we have our own library at the Ateneo de Manila University, which houses the Jesuit collection, the religious order that founded the Ateneo de Manila University, and their activities in the south with the Muslims in Mindanao, which actually is a very important part of Islamic history in the country. And then you have the local, the Lopez Library and Museum, located here in our area, known in the area of Pasig. Okay. So some examples of documents that we have that will show you how we have to contend with our own records in the country is that some of them many of them are written this way. which would actually form part of the records from the 15th to the 16th centuries. And of course, each particular period of handwriting, we also have a different set of abbreviations, different set of lettering. Okay, and this one would be popularized by the Italians. That's why we call it the Italica. Then you have the documents written between the 16th century, more or less, 15th, 16th century still, okay, that most of the documents would be written in this way as well. As you see the problem, well, it is very legible, but of course, you would have to see more or less the mixture of Latin and Spanish in our documentation. And of course, the spacing of the words, which you will have to know, because if not, you will get confused by mixing all the words together. So a knowledge of written Spanish is a must in the study of Philippine history. Then you have Cortesana, which was popularized by the French and very popular in the 17th century. Okay, as you see, it would be a nightmare for researchers like us to read this, because there are so many things that would have to be deciphered. And so this is one of the things that I would do in terms of my paleographic classes for students, not only in the Philippines, but foreigners looking for doing research in the country, is that I made that part of a book that I edited was actually understanding Philippine documents, okay, by looking at a list of tables in terms of abbreviations used only specifically in the country. And then you have the German influence in our documents, okay, popularized by the Germans, okay, by the Gothic points that you see there, so again, though legible, you will have to look at it differently from how more or less this particular style of writing would be used. And this one was actually very popularly used by the Catholic Church in the country, and many of their documents are written in this particular style. And then by the 19th century, we witnessed another change in our tradition, in our archival documentation, and that is the introduction of this particular form of writing that would add greatly to the confusion of understanding the documents. Well, we would also jokingly refer to this like the handwriting of medical doctors, okay? When you do not understand basically what you read, but only they would be able to understand it. So this again, okay, would be faced by many of our researchers. And of course, in general, many of our researchers are discouraged to work on the Spanish period simply because of the lack of knowledge of the Spanish language, and also the lack of understanding of written Spanish. Okay, and many of them would concentrate more or less after 1898 during the American period, where the documents would be written in English. Okay, so more or less, in a way that as we are dealing with issues of revisionism now in our particular period in history, okay, and as mentioned by the earlier speaker, Professor Mark, okay, that that there are very sensitive issues in our history, especially during from the American period up to the present, and we have problems regarding revisionism, okay, and it is an issue still very emotional even up to this very present day, especially especially if you look at the period of the 1970s in our history, during the period of martial rule during the time of President Marcos. Well, as I move towards the end of my talk, I'll just show you more or less some of our documents. This one from 1897 at the time of the revolution of the Philippines. And this is document talks about the establishment of a hospital and cemetery for the Chinese in the city of Manila. Okay, and the state of our documents, and I deliberately took a picture of this because if you will see, there's a clip there on the upper left side, which is a totally no-no for handing a document. And so, because that would definitely destroy the document, that part of the document over there. And the same thing here. So as you see, by the 19th century, more or less, okay, well, they go with the previous slides that I've shown regarding, how would I say, regarding types of handwriting used in our documents on the Philippines in the archives. You will see that there would be a gradual, more or less, improvement of writing, especially in the 19th century. And issues like documents like this, and of course, this has something to do with the paper and the ink used, okay? So there is a need actually to preserve documents like this, and before they deteriorate, what is important is for them to be what? To be digitalized, okay? And so understanding abbreviations like this, if you understand Spanish, you will understand what I'm saying here, because these are the kinds of abbreviations that are differently used rather differently in many parts of the Spanish Empire, and this is what our researchers had to contend with. Okay. So what is important actually, and this is something that I always would tell students and professionals. Last year I gave a lecture and set training to 20 parishes, numbering around 60 records manager archivists in one town alone in the Philippines, because of the issue of understanding the documents that they have. So I would always say, no, it's one important thing is to be patient, and then of course to continually study these documents. And just practical suggestions. I don't know what your case would be in Indonesia with regards to handling your archives, your documents, or the state of maybe understanding the use of the Dutch language in terms of that particular period in your history. But I would always suggest one, studying the handwriting carefully, making sure that you familiarize yourself with the handwriting. Next would be begin with that part of the documents that you are familiar with, because if you start with something unfamiliar and you cannot move, then you will practically be stuck there. Sometimes you have that eureka moment of discovery, like it happens to me when I translate a document and I could not find the word for the document. Suddenly I would realize that it's this word, or this is the meaning of what the entire phrase is saying. Use the information surrounding the text as a guide for you, because it may lead you to the answer that you're looking for. Understand the various handwriting styles used in the records, comparing the letters in the alphabet charts, consult sources, materials, and not depending too much time or on a letter or name. So you just continue translating, and that is what basically what I would emphasize, to researchers in the National Archives. So this is an example of a guide that I prepared for students. Okay, so what would be the A as used in the 12th century, as used in the 14th, 15th, and as we move on towards the 17th century. Okay, so the various styles that would be appearing through the periods in our history. And then,
sorry, excuse me, I'm sorry, Prof. Navarro. Could you please wrap up your talk in the next 3 minutes, because we kind of run out of time.
Yes, I will do that. Thank you. Okay, thank you. So, well, it is unfortunate that many of our sources are still in Spanish. So even the guides that I use towards towards understanding these documents. The are still in Spanish, and so I've translated some of these books for use in the Philippines, and pass it on, pass it on to the Department of Education. Also, again, just like the board that I showed you earlier, how to interpret letters, through the periods, and then I made some contributions to this book, a choreographic guide to Spanish abbreviations used in South America and in the Philippines. Okay. And then other materials and sources that you could actually use for understanding documents. So again, this is the case of the Philippines, So I would like to end my talk with this, and I've worked with Professor Bibliesca in Mexico before. And if I may read it, when social scientists translate, and when they do translation work and document, you should read with calmness and attention to detail, avoiding anxiety or worry. Read each specific document word by word, avoiding the trap of confining solely on your memory and knowledge of similar texts and phrases. Take into account all written elements, no matter how minimal they appear. Even the most insignificant mark may have transcendental importance. You should investigate what it means and why it was placed there. Long and difficult text should be read several times until you have a complete transcription. Well, thank you very much and for this time, and thank you for listening. Thank you. Let me just stop the sharing, and thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Navarro, for a very interesting talk about reading archival materials and using paleography to read all of them. And I think we still have 15 minutes for Q&A sessions. And I see someone raise her hand.
Yeah, please.
So,
I saw her hand, Miss. I think I saw Miss Grace earlier raising her hand already, much earlier.
Yeah. Okay. So now I will give the screen to Miss Grace Laksana. Would you please unmute yourself? Or maybe the host can help.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, Miss Grace, I can hear you perfectly.
Okay, my name is Grace Laksana from Universitas Negeri Malang, a colleague of Mbak Indah. Thank you, Mbak Indah, and thank you very much for your interesting talk, Professor Navarro. It's very interesting that I have so many questions, but I've cut them only into 2 questions.
So the first, you may email me your other questions.
So the first questions relate to the colonial relationship between Philippines and Spain. I think when you present your talk on the archives, it implies a lot about the legacy of colonial relations. So I want to ask whether these archives are also part of the way the 2 countries handle legacies of colonialism. So what will be for example, how do you handle the question of ownership? So who owns the archive and how do they manage the archives? Is that also part of the way you handle this issue on the legacies? And the second question is about we know that reading a foreign language archives are very challenging, but we as researchers, historians, we are also demanded to read it critically. So reading the archives is not just about translating the language, but also to ask questions about why and how and things that are not literally there. So how do you teach students, historians, and others to have this capacity while translating and deciphering is already a challenge in itself? So what are the practical hints for teaching and critical readings on archives? So thank you.
Oh, thank you very much, Miss Grace, for your question. Actually, that's a very good question. First, I will answer your first question, and that's also an important question that we are asking ourselves. And well, the archives and documents, or the documents that we have from the Spanish period, and I'm referring to the millions, are the ones only located in the Philippines. Okay, but you see, outside of Spain, outside of the Philippines rather, there are more important documents to be found in the archives in Spain on the Philippines. Because unfortunately, a certain period in our history during the Second World War, okay, let me backtrack. When the Spanish ended their term in the country in 1898, when they left, many of them took our records with them back to Spain, okay, especially the religious orders. Although many of these documents still stayed behind, the important ones were returned to Spain. And a second event in our history that also repeated the same thing was during the Second World War. By 1938, we still had a large Spanish community in the country, and many of these religious orders, the priests, packed their so-called collection and shipped them to Spain for safety. Okay, shipped them to Spain. And you know exactly what happened during the war was that, unfortunately, many government buildings, many church buildings were destroyed, containing many of our documents. Okay. Now, there is a very strong, what we call that, revival of interest of Filipinos towards the Spanish colonial period. Okay. There is now a growing interest of people, students studying the language. Okay, well, partly because economically, with the growth of the call centers in Manila, having a knowledge of a foreign language would add up to your paycheck, you know. And when I returned from Spain several years ago, before going back to university, I was offered a job working in a call center for my knowledge of Spanish. And except that I would have to work from 9 in the evening till 6 in the morning, you know, and I said no. But again, my duty was in the classroom, but there is still a big need, no, for companies like this, for people to know any foreign language like Spanish. Okay, but so the case of our documents in the country is that many of these are now being returned to the Philippines. Recently, the Spanish government gave back thousands of Spanish documents, but unfortunately not the original, but copies of these documents in digitalized form and returned to the country. Well, in a way, I'm happy with that, because under our conditions, well, we still could not house all of these documents perfectly because of the climate in the country. So the originals would be better off in a country where temperature is better, where there's winter, where there's spring. I mean, the climate is more sufficient for sufficient to preserve these documents. Okay. Now, with regards to your second question, okay, I've noticed also a change now in many universities in the country and even in the National Archives with regards to first, the reintroduction of the Spanish language now into the curriculum, which disappeared in 1988. Although it is still an elective course, there is a growing number of students now entering the field. Especially in our Department of History, Spanish is a required subject. And even in the graduate school, Spanish is a required subject, and one of the major exams would be to take an exam in Spanish. Okay, to take an exam in Spanish. And so many of them would enroll in the Spanish Institute of the Spanish Embassy to learn Spanish, or some of them would re-enroll at the university. Okay, but of course, as part of our duty as well is that we train our students to look into understanding the primary records and also the secondary records. And one issue as well is access. Okay, is access. I think I mentioned earlier that although there is the existence of many private archives in the Philippines with good services, good what you call that, well-maintained archives to preserve the document. Unfortunately, our National Archive is still temporarily housed in a different area. And last week there was a big fire at the archives, a big fire. And thank God, the Spanish documents were saved. Okay, were saved because they were transferred already. Okay, they were transferred. So I mean, as so these are the things that we have to contend with. Okay, and of course, government has to do something about this, and I think that is what we are all talking about as well. No, even in the previous talk, you know, government assistance is needed as well. You know, because as I've said, the soul of a nation is found in its records, in its memory. Whether you are a historian or not, all the records of the nation are there in the archives. Okay, and if you do not preserve them, simply the history of that, of our nation, your country, and maybe my country would simply disappear. Okay, because they would already be totally forgotten. Okay, thank you, Grace. If I feel free to email me for any question as well. No, my email is with the organizers. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Navarro.
Yes.
Now we have a question in the chat box from Mr. Fahrul Hakim. He's asking about your stance in the issue of the President of the Philippines who want to change the name of your country to be Maharlika. So what's your stance on this?
Well, our president is very popular, not just in Southeast Asia,
yes, he is,
but everywhere. Okay. Well, you see, well, it is no longer a talk now being popularized. No, no, because it was also raised during the time of President Marcos. There was a move to change it from the Philippines to Maharlika. And one of the reasons is simply because the word Philippines is not Filipino, it is Spanish. To give you a short history, we were named after the King of Spain, Philip or Felipe, and so the Philippines became Filipinas, which in English is the Philippines. Okay, the Philippines. So basically, that is one reason why there was a name to be considered from that, but it did not push through because, well, because historically, well, before the arrival of the Spanish, we had written records, but it is not the record that you see as history written by Europeans, no? Because we were divided into various indigenous groups and then divided into various barangays, or how would I say that, political units. You know, there was no really a symbol of unity. Okay, but that by that time. So this is one of the major reasons that the name Philippines stayed. And of course, it was revived again by President Duterte. And to be honest, I don't know whether he is seriously considering it or simply, as you all know, maybe you've heard our president speak. With all due respect, he talks about a lot of things, okay, from history to politics, okay, entertaining, but of course, again, no, everything has to be based on historical record. So even at the end of his presidency, there is no move actually to change the name. Okay, and personally, I would stick with the Philippines until a record says that the entire country was actually known like that. But again, there is no such thing.
Okay, thank you. That's very interesting. And we have another participant over here raise his hand. Pak Daya Wijaya, could you please unmute yourself?
Mr. Daya, yeah, is that correct, Mr.? Did I pronounce your name correctly?
Pak Daya.
Yeah, Francis.
Hello, Mr. Daya.
Hello. Buenos dias. Good
Buenos
morning. How are you?
dias.
How
I'm
are you?
fine now. You speak Spanish. Yeah, very good.
Thank you. I'm interested in your speech, in your presentation related to Spanish archives or Spanish local archives in Manila. Can you elaborate more some Spanish archives or Spanish local archives related to Malacca Manila connection? And my second question, I also work on the Spice Islands on the Moluccas. I just remember about Lewat Andaya's work in the world of Moluccas. He also refers to the Manila and Moluccas connection during the 16th century.
Yes.
Do you have some information or some knowledge about that? And for the Spanish or Philippine or local sources related to the Manila and Moluccas or Luzon Moluccas connection. Thank you.
Oh, very good. Thank you. Yeah, very well. As you all know, we recently celebrated 500 years of the arrival of the Spanish in the country. So in a way, we've revised our history because before, and as I was growing up, we used to say the discovery of the Philippines by the Spanish. Now we don't say that. We say the arrival of the Spanish, because we were never lost. We were always here, okay? Just like Indonesia had always been there, okay? And the other countries, so we were never lost. Now, a very good question is because, as you all know from our history, the main goal was actually by the explorers to look for the Spice Islands, Moluccas, not the Philippines. The Philippines was just there that blocked their way. And of course, it was a matter of understanding, well, at that time, no, latitude and longitude were, although not yet perfect, okay, you will see that, well, through the centuries later on, okay, the degrees of latitude and longitude will be perfected, okay. But again, later on the Spanish would discover the way going to the Spice Islands, to the Moluccas Islands, okay, and then later on the famous so-called return trip to Spain from the Spice Islands, okay, all the way back to Spain, no, what we call the circumnavigation of the world, okay. Well, we are about to celebrate that as well, during the latter part of this year. Now, in terms of sources, well, there are many Hispanic sources actually that I can refer to you, and many of them have been translated already into English, okay, into English. And in terms of, and if you email me, I'll be very happy to make you a list, okay, and also pass it on to you, the information. But for now, what I can tell you would be the areas where you can find many of these documents. Well, first of all, we have the National Archives in the Philippines. But in terms of private archives in Manila, for example, you have the Dominican Archives at the University of Santo Tomas. Actually, the private archives of the religious orders, how would I say, are more complete, more or less, with the information, because they were the ones who moved around. Remember, we were conquered more by the cross, by the missionaries, than by the soldiers, okay? So that is why the religious orders have a very important role in the colonization of the Philippines. So you have the Dominicans at the University of Santo Tomas, okay? Because they were here as early as, and the Agustinians. And if I may, well, I don't know if you can see the chat box. I'll just put it here for everyone. Like in the chat box, you have the Dominican Archives at the University of Santo Tomas, and the Agustinian Archives at Manila. So these areas or these archives would actually have important sources on that particular period, okay, on that particular period. Now, before the pandemic, I was in Portugal to look at the documents on the Philippines at the archives, and there are, one day, hopefully you might, I didn't see them, but I saw the list. There are so many materials still untouched in Portugal on the Moluccas Islands. And they are there because, again, not unlike Spanish, which is spoken in many continents now, Portuguese is just spoken in Portugal and in Brazil, you know. But again, there are so many untouched documents there. But these are the areas, you know, where you can actually get your sources. And as I've said, I'll be very happy to email you more, you know, more specifically if you email me, okay? And what is your second question, Mr. Daya? I think what was that second point that you raised?
Daya?
I think you are muted. There. Okay. What was the?
No, I cannot mute it by myself. So
okay.
Probably. My first question is related to Malacca Manila connection during the Habsburg Empire. Probably, do you have some information about probably some archives or information or sources in Manila? Because honestly, in Portuguese side, I've already here in Portugal, so I
you
try
are
to
there in
look
Portugal.
forward.
I see. You are in Portugal now.
Yeah.
Okay. So you know the archives of Tombo in Lisbon.
Yeah, Arquivo Torre do Tombo.
Tombo. You should go there. That was where I went.
Yeah.
That's good. That's good. You are there in Portugal. But in terms of the Habsburgs, and well, I only can refer you to, well, the works of one Jesuit priest when he translated these documents, and that is the work of Kushner. Kushner. Okay, let me type it also here. Okay. Nicholas Kushner. That's a book, Nicholas Kushner. Okay, Spain in the Philippines. Because, you know, during the period of the Habsburgs, okay, well, until around 1711, okay, there was not much economic activity because everything depended on Mexico, okay, so on our relationship with Mexico. And then when the Bourbons came, okay, that was a different story. But the Moluccas connection already was no longer there because we were more dependent now, or independently supporting ourselves through the local economy from the various provinces. But again, to give you a background on the Habsburgs, this book of Kushner, Spain and the Philippines, would be very important. And then maybe let me look into my catalog still, because this one is more since it's translated into English. But again, no, I'll be very happy to check my catalogs also regards to that particular part in the history of the Habsburgs for you. Thank you, Mr. Daya.
Thank you.
I know you're welcome. Very well. Obrigado.
Nada.
Thank you, Prof. Navarro, and thank you, Pak Daya. I think now we are at the end of this session. Yeah, even though it's very interesting, and I believe there might be more questions, but unfortunately we already run out of time. And thanks again to Prof. Mark Belden and Prof. Francis Navarro and all the participants of this session. And I hope that you find this session is useful and insightful. And we will see more discussion from our presenters in the panel room after this. So now I will give back the screen to Ms. Hawiki. Thanks again.
Thank you very much, Ms. Inda. Thank you very much. Keep safe. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Inda. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Nice to meet you, Professor Belden.
Nice to meet you also. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Enjoyed your talk.
Okay, so Hawiki, I think time is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Ms. Indah Wahyu Pujitami, for helping us to lead the first plenary session. And also thank you very much for our keynote speaker, Professor Mark Belden, to give us some insightful topics about transforming education and research as cosmopolitan practice. And Professor Francis as well, that gave us some excellent and interesting topic about reading archive, especially in the Philippines. Okay, honorable guests, ladies and gentlemen, we will start the parallel session in a few minutes. So we will divide into 5 breakout rooms based on the sub-themes and the topics. And I would like to inform to all participants to join the breakout room on your based on your topic from now. Thank you.